Chapter 1135 Frogran on the Sonia Sea, Pasu Island. The Blue Avenger, which had been summoned, finally arrived at the headquarters of the Church of the Lord of Storms. It was docked at a port. Alger removed the cloth wrapped around his head and jumped off the shipboard, landing firmly on the dock thanks to the wind. The wind-blessed potion he had consumed had long been digested. The reason why he had done so was to make himself appear more like the other members of the church, making them feel a sense of kinship. Years of experience told Alger that it was best to maintain uniformity with the people around him most of the time. He didn't want to appear out of the ordinary. Under the circumstances where he had plenty of secrets, it was even more imperative to do so. Alger, control your impatience. A man who had been waiting at the dock came forward with a smile. He had a head of soft yellow hair and a long robe embroidered with lightning patterns. He was Alger's former partner, but later on, one chose to be the captain of a ghost ship and continue floating out at sea, while the other returned to be a clergyman. Alger smiled as he raised his right hand and struck his left breast. "May the storm be with you. May the storm be with you." The yellow-haired man, who was in his prime, replied with a smile. He immediately lowered his voice and said, "I heard that you've already adapted to the wind-blessed potion?" "Yes, it's very simple. I fly every day and maintain the state of floating. I often use the wind to travel back and forth in different places to quickly adapt. I've already sent a telegram to report this matter." Alger arched his brows to look proud. The yellow-haired man looked around and maintained his volume from before. "It's no wonder you were summoned back. I heard that, because of the ongoing war, there's a lack of manpower on all sides. The Council of Cardinals has decided to organize a group of wind-blesseds to advance to Sequence 5 as soon as possible. You should be within those ranks. How enviable. I just became a wind-blessed, so I don't have the chance. Organize a group of wind-blesseds to advance as soon as possible." After knowing that there might be a world war ahead of time, Alger Wilson wasn't surprised. A word suddenly appeared in his mind: cannon fodder. In fact, just from his contributions for the Bansi Harbor incident, Alger, who was only a seafarer back then, could have advanced to Ocean Songster without any obstacles. Furthermore, he was usually hard at work, having completed countless missions. In the end, he had only become a wind-blessed. He had to join the queue for an opportunity to advance to Sequence 5. And now, there was no need for him to do anything. He was suddenly placed on the list of candidates, and he would soon enter the ranks of the quasi-upper echelons of the church. He couldn't help but feel suspicious. Indeed, once a full-scale war begins, the order that prevents people like us from rising will split apart. However, the most important thing is to survive the war. Only by surviving will everything be meaningful. As Alger's thoughts raced, he asked in surprise, "Signs, is that true? I can't be sure. In short, that's what I heard. Let's go and catch up. If you have the chance to become a high-ranking deacon or a cardinal, don't you forget us." The yellow-haired man named Signs reached out his hand and patted Alger on the shoulder. Alger dodged without a trace and replied with a smile, "Definitely." One in the City of Silver, the expedition team brought back news that there was a sea on the other side of the giant king's court. All the citizens temporarily entered a state of excitement. After 2 days of waiting, Derek Berg finally received a notice from the 6-member council, permitting him to receive the classical metallurgist's potion formula. This meant that the upper echelons of the City of Silver had agreed to exchange for the special mushrooms. The advancement ritual is to personally refine a stone of life. What's a stone of life? There's no explanation here. Derek glanced at the parchment in his hand and began preparing a ritual without much thought. In his opinion, Mr. Fool definitely knew what the stone of life was. He didn't need to worry about Mr. World. After setting up the altar, he took out 2 metal tubes, each containing the blood of him and a Dawn Paladin from the City of Silver. The Dawn Paladin had reached a certain age, and his body could no longer withstand the corrosive effects of the poison in most foods. In the foreseeable future, he would gradually reach the end of his life. 2 days ago, his granddaughter had personally delivered the final stab with a sword. As for Derek, he had previously obtained the chief's approval and found an opportunity to extract some of the deceased's blood. As for the devil's blood that Mr. World needed, the City of Silver's inventory temporarily didn't have one. However, Chief Colin Iliad said that, as long as the mushrooms could satisfy the needs of the City of Silver's food requirements, he would organize a small hunting team and go to a region where devils appeared. After placing the 2 metal tubes and goatskin parchment onto the altar, Derek took 2 steps back and faced the lit candles as he began the sacrificial ritual. After a series of tasks, the illusory door that was formed from flames and spiritual materials opened heavily. After the sacrificial items were taken away, a dark glow was left behind. The brilliance slowly faded as large numbers of mushrooms of different shapes appeared before Derek's eyes. As for whether they looked strange, Derek didn't even think about it. This was because he had seen mushrooms once, abnormal ones. Therefore, he lacked a point of reference for comparison. After recalling Mr. World's description of different breeds of mushrooms and effects, Derek quickly categorized them and placed them into different leather handbags. Immediately after, he picked up the unshadowed crucifix excitedly and prepared to head for the spire. However, just as his hand touched the bronze cross, he felt it burn and feel prickly. It was as if a light was seeping out of the rust and shining at the mushrooms. They're evil and need to be purified. Derek was confused, but he eventually decided to believe in Mr. World. He hid the unshadowed crucifix and carried Thunder God's roar. He walked all the way to the spire and met Chief Colin Iliad. "Are these the mushrooms?" As he spoke, Demon Hunter Colin's eyes reflected 2 complex dark green symbols. His gaze swept across the different mushrooms that were either pure white and full, or filled with flesh. Yes, Derek began introducing them, one by one. Colin returned to normal and remained silent for a few seconds. "There's an evil and tainted aura emitted from them, but they're in minute amounts and can be tolerated. This must have settled down after they devoured the flesh and blood of monsters." He paused for a moment before saying, "Let's first test their proliferation ability." Following this sentence, a number of City of Silver personnel, who were prepared to usher in the mushrooms, carried a few monster corpses into the chief's room and scattered them over the different kinds of mushrooms. The moment those mushrooms came into contact with the flesh, they immediately grew hyphae and burrowed into them. About 20 to 30 seconds later, they began to rapidly expand and spit out spores. After a while, the corpses of those monsters were densely covered with mushrooms. However, the mushrooms didn't stop growing. They kept growing upwards, and in the end, some of them were even taller than Derek Berg, facing him as if they were looking down at him. Mr. World didn't say that they would grow this large. Besides, the speed at which it grows is way too fast. Derek looked at it in a daze, but he didn't think it was a problem. There wasn't much of a change in Colin Iliad's expression. Only after the monsters were left with skeleton and dregs did he look around. "It's better than I expected. Next, who wants to try the effects of eating it?" Without hesitation, Derek took a step forward and said, "Your Excellency, I'll do it." He was in charge of importing the mushrooms, so he definitely had to personally confirm its safety. Colin Iliad nodded slightly and said, "Okay." He then turned his head and said to another City of Silver resident, "Invite Elder Lovia over to prevent any accidents." As a Beyonder who controlled flesh and blood, Lovia could resolve most of the changes in the human body. Of course, whether the mutated individual could survive was another matter. Everyone waited for a few minutes before Shepherd Lovia, who was wearing a deep purple robe, arrived in the chief's room. She had just passed through the door when her light gray eyes suddenly narrowed. She instinctively looked at the mushrooms that occupied most of the space. After staring at it for a while, Lovia looked at Colin Iliad and nodded slightly, indicating that she was ready to provide any help. Without any hesitation, Derek Berg chose a black mushroom that was embedded with blood-red threads and marbling, standing at half his height. He tore off the mushroom that had wrapped around the skeleton, and he produced a bonfire and began roasting it. Gradually, a fragrance that seemed to be able to drill into one's stomach emanated out. This was a smell that the residents of the City of Silver had never smelled before. Their throats bobbed as they instinctively swallowed a mouthful of saliva. The bonfire emitted a sizzling sound before the fragrance grew stronger. This wasn't the usual sound. It was as if it could make one's soul yearn for this strange smell. It was the type that everyone was rather familiar with. It was the natural desire for black-faced grass food after returning to the City of Silver, having not eaten them for a long time. As the sizzling sounds grew louder and frequent, they felt as though a hand had reached out from their stomachs, eager to grab the food back. Unknowingly, the other City of Silver residents who had been doing something else in the spire had followed the fragrance and gathered at the door. It took Derek a great deal of effort to control himself from tasting the mushroom midway. He waited until it was completely charred yellow on the outside before he took it back and blew at it. At that moment, everyone's eyes were on him, including Colin Iliad and Shepherd Lovia. With his faith in Mr. World and Mr. Fool, Derek didn't speak. He lowered his head and bit the mushroom. SSSS, he let out a sound of being scalded before chewing and gulping it down. After nearly half of the mushrooms were gone, Derek raised his head, his face slightly red. His mouth was glistening with oil as he mumbled, "It's such a weird taste. I can't help it. I can't stop." Colin Iliad sized up Derek for a few seconds before turning his head to look at Shepherd Lovia. Lovia slowly shook her head and said, "No problem." The surrounding people of the City of Silver immediately let out cheers as they rushed forward and surrounded Derek. They either wanted to share a piece or ask him what to do with the other mushrooms. When Colin saw this, his expression gradually relaxed. He slowly closed his eyes and lifted his chin. He took a deep breath of the fragrance that had filled the room. The City of Silver held a mushroom ritual? Isn't this a little strange? Also, what's a stone of life? Yes, the people from the Church of Earth Mother definitely know, and Frank is no exception. Above the gray fog, as Klein listened to Little Son's latest report, he opened the parchment that he had received but hadn't had the chance to read in detail. The reason why he had rushed back to the real world after the sacrificial and bestowment ceremony was because the serialized horror stories of Baklan's hospitals in several newspapers had reached its climax. Hence, he received a lot of feedback over the past few days. He was at the critical moment of having his Bizarro Sorcerer potion digested. And now, he had already completed this step. He was already prepared to advance to Scholar of Yore. Chapter 1136 Rumors from Ancient Times. Putting down the classical metallurgist potion formula, Klein cast his gaze towards the 2 tubes of blood Little Son had sacrificed. Then, he beckoned for a ceramic jar wrapped in layers of paper figurines. This was the Beyonder blood from different pathways that he had previously gathered. It had been placed above the gray fog and sealed with the paper angel in order to slowly integrate it into this mysterious space's aura, removing the connection between the blood and the individual. This was to prevent any accidents from happening to the provider when the door of the symbols was opened. To him, it was fine if he suffered backlash. After all, there was at least one more chance of him reviving. If it would affect those who trusted him and gave their blood, he would rather not do it. After peeling off the paper figurines at the mouth of the jar and pouring the 2 tubes of blood into it, he conjured a glass stick and reached in to stir it. Right on the heels of that, he used Paper Angel and sealed it again. "I'm just short of prisoner, devil, and demoness. After I complete the ritual, I'll personally pay Miss Sharon a visit. It's better to make a request in person regarding such matters. It's too rude to do it by writing letters. Only Miss Magician is a little special." Clearly, she would prefer it if I wrote a letter rather than meet Gehrman Sparrow in person. She actually used the excuse that the ink had frozen due to the low temperatures to delay her writing. Are her magic tricks just for show? Thankfully, my potion has already digested, so there's no need for me to push her anymore. Klein mumbled inwardly as he threw the ceramic jar covered in paper figurine back into the junk pile. After leaving the world above the gray fog, he didn't immediately prepare to advance to Scholar of Yore. Instead, he took out a pen and paper and drew the symbol that was a mixture of concealment and mystery prying. This was something he had planned to do before he consumed the potion, to ask Rhodes about Sapphira Castle. As the symbol took form, the light in the originally badly lit room became darker, as if clouds were drifting past, blocking out the sun. After more than 10 seconds, the full-body mirror with cracks suddenly rippled with aqueous light and silver words quickly appeared. Exalted Great Master, your devoted, loyal and humble servant, Rhodes, is here to answer your summoning. I am still the servant that you trust the most, the closest and most favorite, right? This question. I seem to be able to read the panic and anxiety of this magic mirror. Does it feel a sense of danger? After some thought, he nodded in amusement. Yes. Actually, that has never been the case. I'm just comforting you. After answering, he silently added in his heart. The surface of the mirror lit up and the silver words were dyed golden. They squirmed and formed a new sentence. Great Master, do you have any questions for me? Yes. Klein secretly tensed up. What do you know about Sapphira Castle? Rhodes fell silent for a few seconds before the pale golden words changed. I don't know much about this. I've only heard some rumors. In the early days of the Second Epoch, the ancient gods believed that the original creator left some things behind. That might be a kingdom formed from a certain part of his body or something created by him. And Sapphira Castle is one of them. This was the name that the king of demonic wolves, Fleegria, gave. He calls the hounds of Fulgrim as Sapphira Castle keepers. However, he failed to enter Sapphira Castle even to his death. Therefore, many powerful creatures suspect that Sapphira Castle doesn't actually exist, but is just an abstract concept. It had something to do with the original creator? After pondering for a while, he said, one of them. How many other entities like Sapphira Castle are there? 8. There are detailed records on the second blasphemy slate. Unfortunately, I haven't seen it. On the surface of the mirror, lines of words appeared one after another. However, the pale gold color faded away, becoming silver once again. The ancient gods suspect that the source of the underground corruption comes from a place similar to Sapphira Castle. They call it the Chaos Sea. Also, there are rumors that deep in the spirit world city, Calderon City, there are clues to the river of eternal darkness. This comes from the ancient god, Phoenix ancestor Gregrace. As for the others, I've heard of some names, but it's not a complete list. There's Tenebrous World, Knowledge More, as well as the brood hive that's related to the moon. There are a total of 8. Chaos Sea, River of Eternal Darkness, Knowledge More, Tenebrous World, and Brood Hive. Brood Hive is related to the moon. It sounds very dangerous. I wonder if it has anything to do with the Mother Tree of Desire. Klein silently repeated the key information in Rhodes's response. He had a nagging feeling that he should be able to grasp something, but he didn't gain much from it. He even lacked the ability to piece together the clues. When he saw that Rhodes had only heard rumors and didn't have any actual understanding of them, he organized his thoughts and said with a smile, "From the looks of it, you might come from the Chaos Sea. That's not important. What's important is that I'm your loyal, lowly, and obedient servant." Rhodes said the entire sentence at once. Obedient, this use of words. Klein silently lampooned before asking, "What are the origins of Dark Angel Sasrer?" On the surface of the mirror, silver words formed one after another. I similarly can't see it, but at that time, there was a myth that said that, when the ancient sun god was born, he was light and darkness combined. After all, he calls himself the creator, so he must be well-rounded and not lacking anything. Later, he separated the darkness in his body and used it to create the first angel with one of his ribs, Dark Angel Sasra. This rib. I can totally imagine it. Back then, it was the ancient sun god who personally fabricated and spread this myth. Amon's brother, your wife has become the Dark Angel. Klein was first alarmed before many strange ideas arose in his mind. As his thoughts settled, he began to analyze the truth behind this myth. With such a myth spreading, it will cause the believers to believe that Dark Angel Sasra is the dark side of the ancient sun god. They would worship him in the same way as the Lord. No one objected or forbade this myth. As for Dark Angel, he was ultimately the deputy of the divine kingdom, God's left hand. So this implies that this was very likely true. What happened afterward can be summarized as the dark side of the ancient sun god colluding with foreign enemies, bewitching the kings of angels and assassinating the main body. This can explain why Ouroboros and Medici joined Ro's redemption. They were only following the orders of the Lord. From this angle, isn't the position of Dark Angel Sasra, in the ancient sun god's divine kingdom, equivalent to the world of the Tarot Club? Thankfully, the world is a fake person. He doesn't have his own spirituality and thoughts. As he thought about it, he suddenly felt drenched with sweat. He was glad that he was a seer and not some other pathway. Based on his previous reasoning, he quickly guessed the reason why Dark Angel was sleeping in the giant king's court. Perhaps it has something to do with the fall of the ancient sun god. Therefore, the brother of Amon, the dragon of wisdom, and the true creator wished to confirm the state of Dark Angel Sasra. However, there are many other problems. In the 22 Beyonder pathways, which pathway is this king of angels, the left hand of God? The marauder has Amon, apprentice has Mr. Door, spectator, reader, bard, sailor, secret suppliant, warrior, sleepless, planter, savant, monster, hunter, and arbiter are obviously impossible. Corpse collector is also impossible due to the existence of death in the fourth epoch. It's impossible for there to be a king of angels to exist at the same time, unless the Dark Angel had already fallen to sequence 2. By the same logic, the seer and lawyer pathways can be eliminated for now. It can then be confirmed that the Dark Angel is no longer a king of angels. Mystery Prior, Moon, and Devil are all certain possibilities. I cannot eliminate the possibility that the hidden sage, primordial moon, and the dark side of the universe are the Dark Angels, alt. Yes, there might still be the mother tree of desire hidden within. It's also possible with Prisoner. There's no clear evidence that this pathway has produced a true deity. Back then, the chained god might not even be a king of angels. After some thought, he said to Rhodes, "It's your turn to ask." On the cracked full-body mirror's surface, silver words twisted together and formed a new sentence. "Great Master, may I guess what you want to ask next?" Klein nodded slightly and answered, "Sure. You wish to ask about Sasra's current state?" My answer is, I don't know, as I can't see. Behind the silver words was a smiley face with a simple drawing. Not bad, Klein praised. That's all for today. I will summon you again in the near future at any time. Yes, Great Master. Your loyal servant, Rhodes, is constantly preparing to serve you. On the surface of the mirror, the simple smile on his face turned into a waving cat's paw. When the mirror returned to normal, Klein took out a pen and paper and wrote down what he had just learned. This was one of the documents he had prepared for the scholar of your ritual. In the past few days, he had written a lot of documents on ancient history. Following that, with the information and 2 marionettes, he teleported to the southern continent. He didn't dare to advance in Backlund. If anything were to happen to him, Amon and Zeradol would definitely be able to detect it and come straight for him. Chapter 1137 Amidst History on a Barren Island in the Berserk Sea. This place wasn't far from the southern continent, but it didn't belong there geographically. The reason why Klein had chosen this island as a place for himself to advance to Scholar of Year was, firstly, because he wanted to avoid Amon and Zeradal to the best of his ability. He also didn't want to enter the region where the Mother Tree of Desire had a wide range of influence. Secondly, because the Berserk Sea was enveloped by the power left behind by death, this was, in a way, a part of the Evernight goddess's kingdom. If the ritual were to create a huge commotion, it was possible for some effective screening. Furthermore, this place is very desolate. There aren't many creatures here, so there's no need to worry about any accidents affecting the innocent. Klein surveyed the area and began to set up a ritual. He brought the corresponding materials back from above the gray fog to the real world. Following that, he flipped through the thick ancient history documents and pulled out some records that he couldn't be certain of. Those that couldn't be confirmed with divination were also removed. Pa! With a shake of his hand, the scarlet flames rose and devoured the stack of paper. The supplementary ingredients needed for the Scholar of Your potion were a large amount of real ancient historical records. Therefore, he didn't want to take the risk of using things he couldn't be sure of. He would rather have fewer of them. After making his selection, he poured the Hound of Fulgrim's blood into a huge cauldron and placed the few white frost crystals that he had weighed beforehand into it. The moment the two supplementary ingredients came into contact with each other, a thin mist immediately rose up. It enveloped the container and was about half the height of a person and an arm wide. With a glance, Klein followed his spiritual intuition and temporarily gave up on adding the last supplementary material. He first got his marionette, Enuni, to grab the demonic wolf of fog's transformed heart and threw the item that seemed condensed from white mist into the cauldron. As white frost condensed across Enuni's arm, the mist that emanated from the vessel became extremely dense. It began to contract and expand, as though it was alive, like a slowly beating heart. Without any hesitation, Klein controlled his marionette, Enuni, to pick up the pair of eyes from the Hounds of Fulgrim. He stuffed the two dark red flame-like objects into the seemingly corporeal mist. The mist's color quickly darkened, making it impossible for him to see the huge cauldron at its core. He didn't panic. Instead, he calmly got his other marionette to throw page after page of the ancient historical records into the blob of thick, dark mist. The thick mist slowly collapsed. After digesting the historical records, it finally fell back into the cauldron, like water vapor, turning into something that coexisted as both a liquid and a gas. Its color was dark red, almost the size of a baby's head. Upon seeing this scene, Klein removed the spirit pendulum from his left wrist and used divination to determine if the potion was successfully concocted. He received a revelation that it was rather dangerous, but one that he could barely withstand. And this meant that the potion was successfully concocted. Even if it were strictly concocted according to the formula, a sequence 3 potion is equivalent to poison. If I can withstand it, I'll advance. Otherwise, I'll go crazy, lose control, or even die. After staring at the topaz pendant spinning rapidly in a counterclockwise direction for a few seconds, he pulled up the silver chain and wrapped it around his left wrist. He cast his gaze at the potion floating in the cauldron as thoughts flashed across his mind. A Bizarro sorcerer's acting not only has the key terms of fear, horror, directing, and inexplicable, there's also some level of mystery, unknown, complicated, and unpredictable aspects of fate. The two aspects combine to form a complete Bizarro sorcerer. This is a behavioral style, while the other is the attributes. And to me, my origins are such a mystery that I haven't even figured out the truth. I've experienced so many complicated matters that I've already stopped a true god from descending, scared a king of angels. Even my fate is so unpredictable that a snake of Mercury is unable to discern. Therefore, I've already acted in advance and naturally digested that portion of the potion. There's no need to summarize the principles. This truly reflects the single word bizarro. Yes, the ritual requirements for Scholar of Your requires me to be completely separated from reality for at least 300 years. Only after I become history and no longer belong to the present era do I consume the potion. My life while I was sealed within a cocoon and hung above the grey fog is more than enough. But after becoming Klein, I've experienced too many things in the past year. I've already left a mark in the present era. Would it affect the effects of the ritual? It should be. Fortunately, it hasn't even been 2 years. The mark won't be too deep and can barely be accepted. After all, it's impossible for me to hang myself up for 300 years again before I consume the potion. There's another decade or so until the apocalypse. Furthermore, the ancient history I grasp is definitely far superior to any bizarro sorcerer. It can be considered as me effectively acting ahead of time. I can definitely avoid many dangers. As his thoughts raced, Klein took a deep breath and stopped thinking about it. Wearing a silk top hat and a double-breasted coat, his skin suddenly turned transparent as maggots that contained three-dimensional symbols crawled out. The transparent maggots were itching to move, as if they were going to crawl into the dense mist in the cauldron, leaving behind only empty clothes and hats. Klein managed to barely control his state as he calmly extended his right hand and picked up the potion that was wrapped in mist. The potion didn't seem to have any weight as it floated in front of his face. Klein opened his mouth and took a deep breath. The potion instantly transformed and extended into Klein's mouth, making him feel like he was devouring a dark red glow. The transparent maggots swarmed back into his body, tearing down the parts of the potion and swallowing them. As his mythical creature form was special, both a full body and also separated into many small parts, Klein could only consume the potion in such a manner. Of course, if he could control his incomplete mythical creature form, it would be much simpler. Without a sound, he felt a cold feeling spread through every worm of spirit, with a searing pain. A familiar, boundless grayish-white fog appeared in front of him. It enveloped the entire world, revealing some of his past experiences. This included the terrifying legends he created, his conversation with the Red Angel evil spirit, the treatment of the demigod, Luca, with the help of Miss Justice, hunting Vin Rambus, dealing with Amon's avatars, revenge on Insanguil, exploring Calderon City, infiltrating St. Samuel Cathedral, dominating the seas, stopping the True Creator's descent, saving Tingen, and various other details of his daily life. They made conflicts with different people and things, becoming extremely complicated as they merged into a sea. As he flew through it, he was unable to find a clear and accurate sense of self. He felt like he was about to be lost in this area. The cold, burning pain constantly drove him forward, so as to expel the influence on him. This made it difficult to return to the real world. With great difficulty, Klein managed to control this feeling. As he gradually lost consciousness and his body slowly descended, he tried his best to find something that could confirm his identity. Finally, he saw the deep depths of the grey fog. At the end of the sea was a shattered spot of light. With a thought, he followed his intuition and flew over in a manner that seemed to travel the cosmos. There was a figure hanging from the blurry door of light in the spot of light. He was stored in a transparent cocoon as he swayed gently. He looked like the original Zhou Mingrui. This had nothing to do with his surroundings. He was alone and easily grasped. I couldn't see this before when I used the yesterday once more charm, but I can actually do so now. In other words, during the advancement process, I can indirectly influence the Sapphira castle above the grey fog? Wait, my ability to think has been restored. Klein's consciousness instantly cleared up as he finally understood the essence of the ritual. By eliminating the interference, he could provide a clear definition of himself to become a scholar of yore. This prevented him from getting lost. Following a similar spot of light, Klein began to fly deeper into the grayish-white fog. Along the way, he discovered that the surrounding fog was scattered with fragments of light. They had colonial phases, times when Roselle ruled, the Battle of the Violated Oath, the White Rose War, the 20-Year War. These were all bits of history that Klein knew of the Fifth Epoch. As he passed through them, he naturally split his consciousness and completed an invisible connection, making his definition of his own identity even clearer. In the Pale Era, during the War of the Four Emperors, the Trunsoist Empire, the Tudor dynasty, the United Empire, Solomon's First and Second Empire, the fall of Red Angel, the Blood Emperor's apotheosis, the Black Emperor's return, and other historical fragments continued to surface as Klein kept rushing forward. They appeared in different spots in the endless gray fog, like the stars in the night sky, they illuminated the path to return. In such a manner, Klein felt that he was becoming more and more lucid. Every worm of spirit's coldness and burning sensation became milder. He could have turned around a long time ago and returned to the real world. However, he didn't stop and continued flying forward. Scenes of the fatal attack of the Rose Redemption, the three great angels, White, Storm, Wisdom sharing in the body of the ancient sun god, and the plotting in the giant king's court with the Church of Evernight, Earth, and combat hiding as secret organizations flashed across the grayish-white fog. The more he proceeded forward, the more relaxed he felt. He felt like he was about to fly up from running down a runway. At some point in time, a group of terrifying canine-like creatures with dark red eye sockets appeared beside him. They ran around the indiscernible bottom of the gray fog as they followed him by his side as if they were accompanying and guarding him. Among them, two of them only had one eye. Klein looked around and smiled. He didn't stop and continued proceeding deeper into the gray fog. The history of the Dual Era and the early era of fire swept past him from behind, pointing out the path that led forward. Finally, Klein stopped in front of a lonely fragment of light. Inside was a withered forest and a normal-sized tomb. He went forward and saw that the grayish-white fog was silently enveloping everything. It was unknown where the other fragments of light were floating. Feeling his spirituality depleting, Klein didn't continue the search. He connected his consciousness to his origin, and he suddenly plummeted. As the gray fog rapidly faded away, Klein felt his body and saw the cauldron in front of him. He didn't care about his current state, and he subconsciously looked up into the sky. He directly saw the gray fog and the ancient majestic palace above the gray fog. The mysterious space was trembling slightly. In Backlund, a postman who was riding a bicycle stopped. He turned his head slightly and adjusted the monocle on his right eye. He then muttered to himself, "Sapphira Castle." After a few seconds of hesitation, the thin-faced young man curled his lips and laughed. His expression was filled with anticipation. In a rental apartment at East Borough of the same city, figures hanging in the air swayed gently. At the same time, they simultaneously made a sound, "Sapphira Castle." In the basement of St. Samuel Cathedral, Leonard Mitchell, who was assigning missions to his team, suddenly heard an elderly voice in his mind, "Sapphira Castle." Chapter 1138 Scholar of Ur, in the Highlands, on an altar with eyes, arms, heads, and organs embedded in it. Dark red blood-red light surged out like a tidal wave, distorting into the shape of a deformed tree. Amidst a buzzing sound, the human bones, candles, silver plates, and gold boxes trembled, as though they could slice through one's spirit body. The surrounding supplicants instinctively bowed their heads and prostrated. Then, they simultaneously came to a realization, the Berserk Sea, Reef Island, when he saw the ancient palace above the gray fog and sensed the slight tremble of the mysterious space. Klein felt that he had a deeper connection with the so-called Sapphira Castle, one that was hard to accurately grasp. At this moment, he truly felt that place would gradually belong to him. In just a few seconds, all the abnormalities disappeared. Without any delay, Klein got the two marionettes to put away the items that were still of value, and destroy the rest. He took out a paper figurine and shook it. With a smacking sound, the paper figurine ignited with a scarlet flame as dense illusory wings appeared behind his back. When he saw this, Klein was stunned. He never expected that the simple paper figurine substitutes would have hints of Angel's embrace. He then grabbed Konas and Nanuni, using teleport to vanish from the island formed by reefs. After using several islands in the Sonia Sea as waypoints, he took a huge detour before finally returning to his residence in Backland's East Borough. During this process, he repeatedly used paper figurine substitutes, which had undergone several qualitative changes, to disrupt divination, prophecy powers, tracking, and observation. Phew, I didn't expect it to really trigger the changes in Sapphira Castle, resulting in an unconcealable phenomenon. Fortunately, I was sufficiently careful and cautious. I wasn't careless. If I had advanced in Backland or the surrounding areas, I'm certain that Amon and Zeradal would have already seen me. Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he hurriedly took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the grey fog to do a divination. After confirming that he was in a safe situation, he didn't stay for long. He immediately returned to the real world, and with the help of cogitation, he began to restrain his diverging spirituality. After doing this, he took off his clothes, threw himself into bed, and fell into a deep sleep. Normally, a Bizarro sorcerer wouldn't be as exhausted as he was after successfully advancing to Scholar of Yore. He would definitely have energy left to check his physical condition. However, while traveling through history, he relied on his mark to travel a very far distance. He relied on his own mastery of ancient secrets, that far exceeded his current level, to reach the establishment of the giant king's Quran, the early of the second epoch or the end of the epoch. This was equivalent to digesting the potion. After a few hours of deep sleep, Klein woke up as he slowly opened his eyes. He sat up, pulled a pillow to prop him up from behind, and rubbed his temples. After 10 minutes of regulating himself, he was completely awake and began to inspect himself. Indeed, I've digested most of the potion right after I consumed it. At least 80%. This is roughly what I expected, but I wonder how much more ancient history I'll have to obtain before I can digest it completely. From the looks of it, the acting of a Scholar of Yore has 2 main directions. One is a scholar from ancient times, and the other is a scholar who studies ancient history. Both of them are required. The first is relatively easy because the ritual itself contains the key point of making one a person from ancient times. Once the advancement is successful, one can naturally act as a scholar from ancient times. The second point is extremely difficult. It would be alright in normal society, but in this world with true gods, devils, and evil existences, just gathering ancient information is a very risky matter. If I endeavor to gather the truth of history, I might die a horrible death at any moment without any reason. The more I understand, the greater the danger. The reason why I know so much is mostly thanks to the arrangements of a few existences, as well as the complicated fate that Sapphira Castle brings me. This makes me encounter all sorts of things. Of course, even so, I've already died once despite being a true deity's blessed. What's more, other Scholars of Yore. Changing the spot of Miracle Invoker and Scholar of Yore will make acting relatively simple. Unfortunately, there's no such thing. In addition, the previous 2 meanings have an inclination towards ancient times. I have to pay attention to the word scholar. What must I figure out from history before I can be considered a scholar? Next, there are a few directions towards my digestion. First, I need to figure out Dark Angel Sasra's current state and truly replicate the actual process of the cataclysm. Second, I need to spend some effort to connect the history of the 4th epoch together, and not just be fine with having them in disconnected segments. Third, I need to go deep into the details from a macroscopic view. For example, the rise and fall of the Antigonus family. After confirming that prior acting was effective, and considering his future path ahead of time, Klein combined the mysticism knowledge he had gained from his advancement and his observation of his godhood's divinity, and he had a trial run of his powers to slowly figure out the powers of a Scholar of Yore. Worms of Spirit can be split into 600 pieces. The godhood patterns have also changed to a certain degree, it's even more complicated, and it can showcase concepts of strength, strangeness, and supernaturalness. The changes in my godhood patterns firstly originate from the newly obtained characteristic, and secondly, it comes from the mysticism knowledge contained within the potion. This is both a result of the Beyonder characteristic and also something obtained from a higher level. After becoming a true high-sequence Beyonder, is it possible to directly change the knowledge at a higher dimension to affect Beyonders at other sequences? Deciphering a potion formula from the godhood patterns seems like an actual example. Also, at the level of sequence 3, the changes in godhood patterns have a personal effect. This is closely related to prayer and responses. As a scholar of yore, the corresponding honorific names will be different in nature. This is because of different personalities, experiences, and traits. Yes, I can allow different worms of spirit to instinctively listen to prayers and respond to them when it's a relatively uncomplicated matter. It doesn't affect my other actions. The specially marked ones and more complicated matters will be handed over to my actual body. A scholar of yore can use a worm of spirit to act as a god, but what about other sequence 3 Beyonders from other pathways? It's impossible for them to respond while sleeping, right? Heh, I'll think of my honorific name as a scholar of yore later. I'll first study the specific abilities. A scholar of yore's main ability is to obtain help from history. This is split into two parts. One is to borrow strength from my past self. This is rather embarrassing for me. It's currently useless because the past me is definitely weaker than the present me. Yes, when I was hanging above the door of light above the gray fog, I was just an ordinary person. Compared to those who were important figures in the past but are now weak due to all kinds of reasons, this is a godly skill. One can be a baby crying for ice cream while engaging in a sequence 1 battle. It would be impossible to find any weaknesses. The only problem is that it's not long-lasting. Of course, as more time passes after I become a scholar of yore, this will begin to show its effects. I can often borrow strength from my past scholar of yourself so that I wouldn't have any moment of weakness. Even if I were to suffer serious injuries. To a certain extent, this is something that's self-perpetuating, preventing myself from ever being in a nadir until my spirituality is completely drained. Yes, before my spirituality is drained, I can always borrow energy from my past self. There's no limit to the number of times. As for my current spirituality, even without the process of recovering, I can borrow power nearly 10 times a day, maintaining it for 5 minutes each time. The second part is to summon images from the historical void. It can be humans or objects. The more detailed and the better the understanding I have of the corresponding piece of history and matters, the higher the chance of success is and the longer it will last. Similarly, the lower the target's level is, relative to me, the higher the chance of success and the longer it can be maintained. In addition, increasing my affinity with the target will increase the chances of success and the time it can be maintained. These are the 3 conditions to succeed. Furthermore, when summoning someone of a higher level than myself, or an item, even if I barely succeed, the final projection will only have a portion of the strength and quality of the original. It can't be one who's at full strength. Also, I can only maintain 3 images summoned from the historical void at any point in time, including those summoned by my marionettes. Currently, even if it's the most ordinary item or something that was once mine, I can maintain its availability for a maximum of 15 minutes. The fact that the target has a close relationship with me is worth rumination. In essence, borrowing power from one's own body is also a form of summoning. It's just that one's relationship with oneself is extremely close, so there's no possibility of failure. It's an extreme example. In other words, if I were to summon the important figures from the historical void, it would be best to establish a friendly relationship with them and maintain it for a long time. Yes, if I were to summon Mr. Azek's projection, the chances of success will definitely be higher than projecting other angels. How is this a Beyonder power? This is obviously studies related to EQ, relationships, and interpersonal communication. As he sighed with emotion, Klein sincerely felt that the core powers of a scholar of yore were godly. After all, those that involved history and time were most likely extremely magical. However, in order to put it to use to its fullest potential, one had to have sufficient intelligence, and also make the necessary preparations. This was an unchanging requirement of the seer pathway. Yes, when summoning images from the historical void, there's no way to communicate with them. That is to say that a scholar of yore can't interfere with history and change the past. From the angle of acting, this can be summarized as witnessing fate, affecting the present, and the inability to reverse the past, apart from the ability to transfer a certain part of ailments, wounds, curses, attacks, prophecies, and observations to paper figurine substitutes. There's another power. It can transfer a certain part to the target. Before one discovers that it's fake, things can continue proceeding as per normal. If anyone loses their heart while their brain remains active, I can give them a paper heart for a short period of time. He will be able to obtain strength from history to beat and circulate blood. The time it takes to attain initial control of spirit-body threads has shortened to 2 seconds, and completely transforming into a marionette takes 10 seconds. The maximum range for the two is 500 meters. By controlling a marionette, the limit to swapping positions is 5 kilometers. Flame jump is also 5 kilometers. I can freely control the might of air cannon, and at its maximum might, it's equivalent to a coastal defensive cannon. A creature that can transform into a physical form whose characteristics have a difference that does not exceed a certain level. Some of the organs created can be used, while others are only decorations. Phew, this is a scholar of yore who has digested most of the potion. After examining himself, Klein slowly stood up. He planned on entering the world above the grey fog to check on the changes in Sapphira Castle. Chapter 1139. A different form of companionship. Above the endless grayish-white fog, Klein's figure appeared in the ancient palace. He only looked around briefly, and he realized that there were a few changes. The most obvious point was that the state of the mysterious space and its layout had been fully projected into his spirit body. Even at a great distance, he could still see the grayish-white clouds and that strange door of light. Apart from the palace that I conjured and the door of light that originally existed, there's nothing here. It's empty, boundless, and full of power of a high level. As he murmured, he sat down, raised his right hand, and gently lifted it up. In the blink of an eye, the entire grey fog boiled. The mysterious space it carried quaked as beams of slightly dark light emitted. When the light gathered together, it condensed into a translucent angel with illusory wings on its back, as per Klein's will. It had the same level and power as an angel. It was majestic and sacred, with an oppressive aura. There's no need to add the Black Emperor card, the Tyrant card, or the Red Priest card. There's no need to use the Sea God Scepter either. With my power alone, I can stir most of the powers of this mysterious space to its fullest potential, allowing the Fool's Angel to become a true Sequence 2 angel. Of course, this angel is unable to respond to prayers or be maintained for too long. It only exists in the embrace form and within a few attacks, having some powers in the domain of miracles. Indeed, being able to revive is a gift from Sapphira Castle. As for how many more times I can be resurrected, I can't come to a conclusion now. If I can obtain a grade 0 sealed artifact and use its level to observe it, should be able to see it more clearly. I'll just treat it as one more time. It's not a bad thing to err while being cautious. This reminds me to be careful and cautious. This is the way for Beyonders of the Seer pathway to survive. Unfortunately, this miracle can only be used for myself for now. Yes, at most, in order to truly possess and control this mysterious space, I have to become an angel or even a Sequence 1 angel at least. It lives up to its name as Sapphira Castle. As for that strange door of light, its requirements are even higher. It's impossible to tell if there are any hidden dangers at the moment. What's the meaning of the existence of Sapphira Castle? Baiting transmigrators to revive the original creator? With a flick of his right hand, the holy and powerful angel dissipated in midair. The entire Sapphira Castle calmed down. Following that, Klein stood up and took a step towards the grayish-white cloud in midair. He stood in front of the strange door of light formed from countless spherical lights. The door of light was tainted with some bluish-black color. Each spherical light's essence was a transparent and translucent worm that formed into a ball. As he stared at the transparent cocoons hanging by the black threads, Klein extended his right hand and slowly reached out to the door of light in an attempt to touch it. 1 inch, 2 inches, 3 inches. His hand finally touched the edge of the door of light, but it passed right through as if it was just an illusion. However, compared to his previous attempt, the illusory door of light was clearly a little stickier, as though it was about to turn corporeal. This is an item that represents the essence of Sapphira Castle? After pondering for a few seconds, he turned and returned to the ancient palace. Without any delay, he left the world above the gray fog and began experimenting with the various powers he had just acquired. I have to first get an honorific name. The prayer response range for a sequence 3 beyonder is a region. This range is different depending on the authority that one wields. Clearly, a Sea King's range is a relatively far-reaching type. Therefore, this honorific name of mine also has its limits. The protector of all the poor children in Backlund? It feels odd. Yes, other people might have a limitation, but it's not necessarily the case for me. I can use the spirit world and the blessed of Sapphira Castle as a replacement. I should be the only one who is blessed in both regions. It's unique enough. This way, as long as someone is in the same city or district as me, they can use this honorific name to pray to me. There's nothing I can do if we're not in the same area. I can't possibly do the same as throwing the sea god scepter above the gray fog, splitting a few worms of spirit to the world above the gray fog, and using Sapphira Castle's level to respond throughout the entire world. Although I can't confirm the relationship between the Dark Angel and the ancient Sun God, this is enough to remind me to be careful with my avatars and marionettes. Also, it's not as simple as splitting a few worms. A large number of worms of spirit have to be left in Sapphira Castle to achieve the desired effect. I'm currently unable to do that. Right, my mental state isn't too bad. I don't have a dissociative disorder, nor do I have the irresistible urge to become cold and terrifying. This means that the mark of a scholar of your in history is his anchor. Also, the Emperor's situation worsened only after he became an angel, causing him to have no choice but to rely on his believers as anchors to anchor him in place. I'm still one huge level away. I need to find out what else can be used as anchors, apart from believers, to ensure that nothing goes wrong. Amidst his thoughts, Klein picked up pen and paper. He wrote the first line of his honorific name, the blessed of the spirit world and Sapphira Castle. After some thought, he began writing the second and third lines based on his rich experience and knowledge he got from his godhood patterns, the mystery stemming from ancient times, the witness of an extended history. Since a sequence 3 beyonder wasn't a true deity, he couldn't use a 3-line description. After some thought, he added 2 more lines, protector of magic and drama performers, the great German sparrow. In fact, non-true deities could also use 3-line descriptions, but one of them had to rely on the level of a true god. For example, Klein could use, blessed of the Evernight goddess. Under such circumstances, it was essentially similar to a type of summoning incantation, not an honorific name for prayers, similar to that of messengers. And if the messenger was a spirit world creature, the restriction of being the blessed of a particular true deity was unnecessary. Therefore, it was often unknown what would be summoned, making it rather dangerous. After repeatedly deliberating for a while, Klein controlled his marionette, Anuni, and recited the honorific name in ancient Hermes. A few seconds later, Klein raised his right hand and rubbed his temples with an odd expression. He didn't hear the prayer. What's wrong with this honorific name? Klein carefully deliberated over it a few times and gradually came up with an idea. I might not be the only blessed of the spirit world and Sapphira Castle. The hounds of Fulgrim also count. I have to add a limitation. After some modifications, Anuni once again recited in ancient Hermes, the blessed of the spirit world and Sapphira Castle, the mystery stemming from ancient times, the witness of an extended history, protector of Backlund magic and drama performers, the great Gehrman Sparrow. I pray for your blessings. I hope you can light up the darkness in front of me. Just as Anuni's voice faded, Klein heard his prayer. Furthermore, it was only heard by a few worms of spirit. It didn't affect his actual body at all. This is very different from the prayer coming from Sapphira Castle. It's very clear. With a thought, his worm of spirit gave a response based on the rules he had made ahead of time. With a whoosh, a ball of fire appeared in front of Anuni. It floated in midair, illuminating the entire room. Not bad. If I use Hermes to pray, I have to set up a ritual and draw symbols. As for essential oils and herbs, it doesn't matter if they're provided or not. Am I someone who will be pleased by these things? The symbols are formed from the scrolls representing history, the complete eye that represents witness, and the line symbolizing change. For the time being, Klein had no intention of spreading his honorific name. After all, letting others know that Gehrman Sparrow had reached sequence 3 would be a case of him losing a trump card. Furthermore, he had the alternate identity as Sea God and the Fool. There was no need for a new honorific name. Pa. With a snap of his fingers, he lit the paper with the honorific name of Gehrman Sparrow on the table. A scholar of your also has the means to create a fog to lower the temperature, but it's not a core power. Next, I have to try to summon a projection from the historical void. Who shall be my first volunteer? As he muttered silently to himself, Klein suddenly sighed. He then half closed his eyes and used his godhood to allow a portion of his spirit to enter the grey fog and roam amidst history. Following the various locations that he had previously established, he instantly arrived in front of a spot made of light. There was a spacious and bright room with 2 rows of floor-to-ceiling windows in the spot of light. In the room, a man wearing a dark red coat embroidered with golden lines was standing by the window, looking at the place where the sun had set. He looked to be in his 30s, with long chestnut curly hair, blue eyes, high nose bridge, and thin lips. He had a neat mustache and looked rather good. Roselle Gustave. In a street in Northborough, a thin-faced young man with a wide forehead and a monocle was sitting in a coffee shop by the side of the road. He held a fountain pen and thought seriously. He raised his other hand and pinched his monocle. Finally, he wrote down a sentence, the blessed of the spirit world and Sapphira Castle. Then, the fountain pen stopped moving, as if he had not thought of what to write next. In a rented 2-bedroom apartment at Eastborough, Klein took out his golden pocket watch and opened it. He had already made an appointment with Miss Sharon and Marie to meet in an uninhabited house tonight. After some thought, he raised his right hand and grabbed at the space in front of him. A simple, ancient brass key appeared in his palm. This was the master key that had once helped him defeat Wraith Steve and prevent the true creator from descending. It allowed one to hear Mr. Door's ravings on the night of the full moon. Now, by summoning it back from the historical void, it could be used for 10 minutes. To a scholar of your anything that they once possessed, regardless if they were eventually sold, returned, destroyed, or lost for all sorts of reasons, can never really be considered lost. They just exist alongside the scholar of your in a different form of companionship. Looking at the master key in his hand, Klein sighed in satisfaction. With this item, if he could grasp the corresponding ritual, he could directly speak to Mr. Door as well. After putting away the master key, he put on his double-breasted frock coat and silk top hat, picked up his golden cane, and walked out of the room. Chapter 1140 Plan S Backlund, East Borough, 7 Pinster Street. After a busy day, Leonard finally had the chance to ask his questions. "Old man, what is Sapphira Castle?" The slightly aged voice in his mind fell silent for a few seconds. He chuckled and said, "The place where you meet every Monday is most likely Sapphira Castle." Leonard never expected to hear such an answer. His mind went blank for a moment. He was surprised, shocked, and confused, mixed together with the thoughts of it being impossible for it to pop out of nowhere and the poignant feelings of how complicated things were. After a while, he pressed in a low voice, "What kind of place is Sapphira Castle?" As though sighing and laughing self-deprecatingly, Palaz Zoroast said, "Actually, I'm not too sure. I've only heard some rumors. It's different from the creation myth, you know. Rumor has it that the original creator left behind 9 different entities. They were kingdoms, cities, rivers, oceans, and keys. Sapphira Castle was one of them. It might not actually be a castle, but something else. As for what its exact form is, you might know it better than me. The reason why I'm certain of its existence is because I sensed it when I became an angel, but I was unable to see it and establish a connection with it. My great-grandfather mentioned a theory that the 9 entities might have something to do with the Sphirot of the second blasphemy slate. Unfortunately, because of various reasons, he was unable to decipher the details related to the Sphirot. Leonard calmed down. Leaning back against the sofa, he asked thoughtfully, "Old man, do you suspect that Mr. Fool is the embodiment of Sphirot?" Based on what he had seen and heard from the Tarot Club and Old Man's occasional lecture, he had a certain understanding of matters regarding the deities. After a long silence, Palaz Zoroast replied, "Perhaps, under the strict curfew at night, there were almost no pedestrians on the streets of Backlund. Occasionally, there would be carriages passing by, carrying people of status." After arriving at the agreed-upon house, Klein wasn't in a hurry to enter. He half closed his eyes, raised his right hand, and grabbed at something in front of him. He pulled out another Sherlock Moriarty wearing a black double-breasted frock coat and a silk half-top hat while holding a gold-inlaid cane. This was the image of him from the historical void when he left his residence earlier. As Klein was right in front of him, this image appeared stiff, like a prop on stage. According to his previous experiments, Klein knew that this was the mysticism principle of a unique shared consciousness in time. To put it simply, everyone was essentially unique. If one's true body remained sentient, the projection wouldn't remain sentient. It was the same when summoning projections of the deceased from the historical void, a result Klein suspected to be attributed to his insufficient level. In short, his projections could only engage in more mechanical and instinctive battles. Something that was unknown to the scholars of yore had prevented them from giving a corresponding answer even if they experienced it for themselves. This confirmed one of Klein's guesses. Those fragments a scholar of yore could see in the historical fog was something he had learned in real life and had studied. Simply put, the fog needed a scholar of yore to light it up, bit by bit. Of course, Klein also suspected that if the historical fragments of the same matter had been mostly lit up, the rest would very likely be presented naturally. At least the corresponding ability won't be lost just because I don't understand it well enough. As long as there's a projection in the historical void, that state will be a complete snapshot. That's enough. Klein looked at the projection that could only act on instinct. His body suddenly vanished and entered the grayish-white fog. Since hounds of Fulgrim, who weren't full scholars of yore, could live in the historical void, there was no reason that a true scholar of yore couldn't. The only problem was that there was a time limit. In addition, if time dragged on, the marionettes in the real world would definitely die. However, this was only changing the form of companionship it had with a scholar of yore. As Klein's body entered the grayish-white fog, his consciousness suddenly came alive in the projection. He raised his hand and pressed down on his top hat. Wearing the face of Sherlock Moretti, he came outside of the house. Following their agreement, he took out the master key and placed it against the door, turning it gently. His figure appeared in the room, and under the crimson moonlight, he quickly surveyed his surroundings. The sofas, cupboards, high-back chairs, coffee tables, and other furniture were evidently old. They seemed to come from the previous century. In the dark environment, in a Gothic regal dress and a matching bonnet, Sharon suddenly appeared on a high-back chair. "Good evening," this puppet lady nodded slightly and greeted him. If she hadn't spoken, she would be a classic and most exquisite doll. At the same time, Marie, who was wearing a white shirt and black vest, also phased into existence on the sofa. "Sir, it's already winter. Aren't you cold wearing just this?" "Ah, right, you're dead, one who isn't afraid of the cold." After lampooning inwardly, Klein took off his hat and bowed at the blonde, blue-eyed, pale-faced Sharon. "Good evening, Miss Sharon." He then turned around and said to Marie, "Good evening." To this wraith who was formerly a zombie, the deepest impression Klein had of him was his card game with the zombies he controlled. "We should play cards when we have the time." He sighed silently. The reason why he suddenly thought of playing cards was because he had previously analyzed the combat styles of Scholar of Yore, and he realized that if he were to encounter Zeradol, both sides would very likely end up playing a card game. You throw a Consul Roselle card, I'll throw an Emperor Roselle card. You throw a Bernadette card, I'll throw a Benoit. If you throw the half-fool card, I'll match it with a Mon. I didn't expect that the battle between a seer would one day become playing cards. It's a realistic, abnormally harrowing game of cards. Sigh, but Zeradol is a sequence 1 angel, and he wouldn't give me a chance to play cards. Besides, my success rate at summoning the important figures in the historical void is rather low. Klein retracted his gaze and took the initiative to say to Sharon, "I've recently needed to do something. It's rather difficult and dangerous. One of the steps is to collect Beyonder blood from the 22 different pathways. As for the Wraith pathway, the only person I can ask for help is you and Marie. You should be skilled at hexes, and you should have a way to remove the connection between your blood and yourself." In fact, he could have attempted to summon Admiral of Blood Seigneur on the spot and mix his blood into the porcelain jar. However, he didn't know if it would be effective, nor could he divine it. After all, this involved a level that exceeded Sequence 1, and he lacked information. The only thing he could confirm was that drawing that symbol didn't bring him and the suppliers any danger. Due to the fact that a Scholar of Yore had many means at their disposal, he had even tried to summon the former witch Trissy. He easily subdued her and smeared her blood onto Groselle's travels. However, it was useless. After some thought, Klein believed that a logical contradiction on the timeline had happened, preventing him from success. That blood was formerly provided by Trissy of the past. The person Groselle's travels pulled in would undoubtedly be the former Trissy, so it was equivalent to changing history. Since history couldn't be changed, the experiment failed. After listening to Sherlock Moriarty's request quietly, Sharon said without any change in expression, "Okay. How much do you want?" Miss Sharon's reaction is exactly as I imagined. Klein took out a glass tube. 1 tube would suffice. Dressed in a Gothic regal dress, Sharon raised her right hand slightly. The glass tube seemed to possess a life of its own as it left Klein's palm and flew over. Right on the heels of that, the doll-like lady's right hand landed on her left wrist. Her nails suddenly grew long and became unusually sharp. With just a light stroke, a wound opened up at her wrist. Blood seeped out, but it didn't drip down. Instead, it floated up and entered the glass tube. By the time the tube was filled, Sharon's wound had healed instantly, leaving no scar behind. The stopper jumped into the tube and spun a few times to automatically seal the tube. During this process, the pale-faced Sharon wore an impassive expression, as if she had suppressed all the feelings in her heart. Looking at the tube of blood in her hand, Sharon reached out with her left hand and touched it, slowly sliding from top to bottom. This was done to remove her connection to the blood. After doing all of this, the blood tube leaped up and flew back into Klein's hands. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" Sharon sat on a high-back chair and said calmly. "Not for now. Thank you." Klein shook his head and snapped his fingers, igniting a scarlet flame in his palm. The flame quickly rose and enveloped the glass tube. By the time the redness dissipated, the blood was gone. This was a new change in Flaming Jump. It could transfer the items on him to his marionette or body. Apart from this, all sorts of Beyonder powers from before had been enhanced and modified. Having used his new powers skillfully, he looked at Sharon and asked casually, "How's the digestion of your puppet potion?" When he first met Miss Sharon, he felt that she was like a doll. He believed that, regardless of her nature, or it being a result of the temperance principle, it would have been a form of prior acting. It would be of great help to the digestion of the puppet potion. "Not bad," Sharon replied calmly. "I should be able to digest everything in another 1 to 2 years. 1 to 2 years. Indeed, no matter how fast it is, it's counted in years. But for me, it's been less than half a year. This isn't something to be proud of. It was all arranged. Of course, if you count the time I was hung above the door of light, it's counted in millennia. Miracle Invoker. If I can escape this fate, I might be able to create a miracle." Klein sighed inwardly and gently nodded. "What are your plans for the time being?" Sharon said, "I hope to restore teacher's body." Marie, who was sitting on the sofa, added, "But didn't you say that the leader of the secret order, Zeradel, is in Backlund and is closely related to the Rose School of Thought?" "Yes," Klein said with a smile. "Wait patiently. There will be a chance." This was actually a form of consolation. Even though he had become a scholar of yore and had found many helpers, he had no intention of dealing with Zeradel at the moment. A sequence 1 in full would definitely be unimaginably terrifying. Furthermore, the more he exposed himself to the path of Seer, the more Klein could understand how terrifying and difficult it was to kill Zeradel. After stopping George Ill's apotheosis, Klein planned on leaving Backlund and giving himself more time to grow. Chapter 1141 Deep Winter Sonia Sea, Pasu Island, Chasm of Storm Cathedral. This was the headquarters of the Church of the Lord of Storms, the holiest of holy temples, a place blessed by a god. The murals that were painted in blue, silver, green, and golden colors seemed rough, but they had a sacred and majestic vibe to them. Coupled with the dome that stood at a height with an excess of 100 meters, it made all who stood there feel how puny they were. It made one unable to resist bowing their head. Alger Wilson had already undergone the ritual and had, truly, become a Sequence 5 ocean songster. At this moment, he had come here with the same batch of recently advanced Beyonders, awaiting the preaching of Pontiff Guard II. Indeed, it's really easy to lose control when consuming excess potions. I've already digested all the past potions, but I nearly succumbed this time. After I leave Pasu Island, I'll borrow the unshadowed crucifix from the sun and purge the excess characteristic. This can both be exchanged for money, and it can also be used to secretly nurture some Beyonders who are loyal to me. Alger used the reflection of the blue stone tiles on the ground to see that his hair had darkened and thickened. At this moment, the sound of a booming musical instrument exploded in the hearts of every Beyonder, spreading extreme fear. Pontiff Guard II walked out with a scepter in hand, went up a dais, and faced the crowd. He said in a deep, rumbling voice, "Congratulations, everyone. You are one step closer to the Lord." He was wearing a papal tiara with sapphires, emeralds, and other gems. He wore a dark blue robe that was nearly black. On top of it was silver and gold silk embroidered with symbols of lightning, storms, and oceans. His aura was deep and majestic, as though a tempest was about to strike. This grounded angel, the spokesperson of the Lord of Storms, was a middle-aged man who looked to be in his 40s. However, everyone knew that Guard 2 had been helming the Council of Cardinals for nearly a century. As a blessed of the gods, this level of longevity wasn't strange in the eyes of the believers. It was normal to not have anything to fear. Upon hearing the pontiff's praise, Alger didn't have any thoughts. He clenched his right fist and struck his left breast, shouting, "Holy Lord of Storms." In the next 15 minutes, they quietly listened to Guard 2's preachings. After completing this process, Alger received his mission from a high-ranking deacon. He was to head to Sonia Island and lay an ambush in the surrounding waters, in search for opportunities to attack the port, or supply ships and Fasak merchant ships. Backlund, Empress Borough, inside the Hall family's luxurious mansion. Just as Audrey put on her blue cloak in preparation to bring her golden retriever, Susie, her maidservant, Annie, and the others to the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation at Phelps Street, she saw her father, Earl Hall, enter through the main door. "Father, good morning. Did you not come home last night?" Audrey looked him up and down in puzzlement. "You could tell?" Earl Hall stroked his lovely mustache and asked with a smile. Realizing that her father was in a good mood, Audrey turned her green eyes and said with a faint smile, "Your coat reeks of cigarettes. It implies that you haven't taken it off for some time. Not to mention that's an outdoor set of clothing." Apart from this, there were many other details that could lead to the same conclusion, but Audrey deliberately didn't mention it. As Earl Hall took off his coat and handed it to his valet, he chuckled and said, "Not bad at all. You're very observant. It looks like your work at the Bursary Foundation has greatly benefited you. I was at the Prime Minister's the entire night, waiting for news." Having said that, Earl Hall sighed and said, "Winter County in mid-Seashire's front line has once again repelled the Faysation attack. With the onset of the harsh winter, we can finally catch our breaths." Audrey blinked, perfectly expressing her surprise. Earl Hall immediately smiled. "I understand your puzzlement. The newspaper only mentions what we want the people to know. The defense lines at the Amantha mountain range and the various cities along mid-Seashire's coast aren't as robust as you think. In the first round of the attacks, our fleet and soldiers suffered a tremendous loss. In order to not cause any panic, we announced that there were wins on both sides. We also made all the large shipyards and factories work like mad to contribute to the war machine. In this period of time, the two lines were almost breached several times. Many critical areas were lost and recovered. These repeated seesaws was apparently a human meat grinder. Luckily, we've finally lasted to this point. This winter will be the turning point of the war. Actually, I know. The number of people who died, went missing, and the casualty numbers might be concealed, but it still presents quite a few problems. Besides, winter might not necessarily be a good thing. Faysak's weather warlocks are very good at using such situations." Audrey's heart sank as she hurriedly controlled her emotions and smiled. "That's great. I hope we can quickly have peace restored." Earl Hall was taken aback as he said, "His Majesty plans to give a speech to everyone in the kingdom on Saturday and tell them that we will prevail. When the time comes, the cities and villages will be gathered at their respective squares. The latest technology will be used to allow everyone to hear his speech." The latest technology. Gather the entire kingdom in various squares to listen to the king's speech. Audrey suddenly thought of Mr. World's reminder and decided to inform him of this matter. Organize a large number of people to listen to a speech. This must be the corresponding ritual, right? George III is about to hold the Black Emperor ritual? After receiving the latest news from Miss Justice, Klein returned to the real world with a solemn expression. He paced back and forth in the rental apartment and didn't delay any further. He took out a pen and paper and quickly wrote, "I've already gathered the beyonder blood of 20 pathways. I'm just short of assassin and criminal. George III will be holding a speech for most of the kingdom's citizens this Saturday. You should know what this might mean. In addition, I need the ritual to communicate with Mr. Dorr. After folding the letter and getting Rionette Tinker to send it out, Klein slowly exhaled as he couldn't help but think of all sorts of thoughts. The Demoness blood shouldn't be a problem. Trissy seems very determined to foil George Ill's scheme. I can reveal something to Queen Mystic, that I'm able to enter the secret mausoleum. Although her main goal is to revive the Emperor and she is unwilling to make an enemy out of George III, the Emperor might not be able to return if George III succeeds. I'm waiting for the chief of the City of Silver to return to provide the Devil's blood. The hunting team that he led has set off for more than 10 days. They should be returning soon. In theory, there's still time. There's no problem. If not, I'll use the 2 contingencies. First, I'll use the Blatherer's aura to replace the blood. Second, I'll summon the devils that I've encountered in the past from the historical void and extract their blood. In a room in the Backlund Bridge area that didn't look anything special. The lustrous black-haired Trissy reached out and retrieved a letter from the mirror. She opened it and her brows gradually frowned. It was especially endearing. Is it finally happening? Trissy's expression changed a few times. She seemed hesitant, resistant, afraid, and confused. Finally, she smiled and muttered in a twisted voice, "I've killed so many people and caused so many tragedies. Even if I were to die this time, it wouldn't be a total loss." After a few seconds of silence, Trissy took out a glass test tube from her black dress's pocket. It wasn't her blood, but another Demoness. Her original name was Sherman, who had later called herself Charmaine. As a qualified, senior Demoness, Trissy had found an opportunity to take some of Charmaine's blood while nurturing her. A necessary component for curses, it might not have been of use most of the time, but it could effectively prevent any accidents. After Charmaine's death, Trissy didn't abandon the tube of blood. This was because there were many occasions when demonesses needed such materials, just like now. City of Silver, in a particular residence. As soon as the lightning frequency increased, Derek got out of bed, lit the stove, and quickly grilled some mushroom bread. This bread was even more exquisite and delicious than the original black-faced grass. He loved it very much, and he looked forward to his 3 daily meals. The only problem was that the yield of mushrooms that could make bread wasn't too high. Due to the limited number of monster corpses, every resident was only limited to 1 claim a week, enough for 4 to 5 meals. After thousands of years of hard work, the area around the City of Silver was relatively safe, with relatively few monsters. Derek heard that someone had deliberately placed himself in the darkness to hunt monsters for the nurturing of mushrooms, hoping to be bait. Then, he was eaten. Those mushrooms have made everyone feel optimistic. That underscores not good. Derek thought of the wistfulness before the chief left and shook his head. He picked up a jar he obtained from another city ruin and poured out some white milk. Frankly speaking, he didn't like milk, but it was described by Miss Justice as something that could help humans grow taller and stronger. This was enough to move him. As a resident of the City of Silver, Derek knew that, as he hadn't chosen the giant pathway, the chances of him growing taller and bulkier in the future were low. However, he secretly hoped to reduce the gap between him and his friends. Milk gave him that opportunity. Gulp. Gulp. With a serious expression, Derek drank today's milk rations. Just as he was about to get some mushroom bread, he suddenly sensed something and looked out the window. A person grew out of the shadows outside the door and said from afar, "Derek, the chief wants me to give you this bottle of blood." "The chief is back?" Derek suddenly stood up and said, "All right, thank you." The moment he finished speaking, he saw the shadow in the gap come alive, pushing out a small metal bottle. Derek knew very well that it contained the devil blood that Mr. World wanted. Chapter 1142 Warning. After removing the paper angel wrapping the ceramic jar, Klein poured the bottle of devil's blood into it, and he stirred it with a glass stick he conjured for some time. Phew, I've finally gathered everything. He looked for a few seconds and sighed. This way, he still had enough time to prepare before George III's ceremony. As for whether the assassin and devil blood had enough time to be rid of the connection with its original host, he wasn't concerned, as he had confirmed that the original owners of the two sets of blood were dead. He divined the origins of the assassin blood to figure out if it belonged to Demonis Trissi. If it did, he considered leaving some and smearing it on the surface of Grosel's travels after everything was over. He was left in disappointment, but he wasn't surprised. He had long realized that Trissi was as cautious as he was. The Demonis pathway also has the instigator sequence. It requires a high level of intelligence. Yes, the instigator and conspirer potions should have the effect of increasing one's intelligence. Otherwise, Danet's future would be bleak. As he thought, he threw the ceramic jar into the junk pile. He then returned to the real world and began to browse through the detailed ritual Trissi had provided. This was a ritual that could help him speak to Mr. Dorr during the full moon. A total of 9 gems. Isn't this too extravagant? He casually muttered as he read it. As a tycoon who had donated quite a bit of money, he still had nearly £30,000 in liquid assets. It wasn't that he couldn't afford gems, but it was too wasteful. After thinking for more than 10 seconds, he decided to try using the images in the historical void as stand-ins. After all, he had no intention of pleasing Mr. Dorr. Once the ritual ended and the gems disappeared, Mr. Dorr wouldn't be able to do anything to him. If it doesn't work, I'll consider purchasing it at the jewelry store. Klein stood up and set up a ritual in the room outside the rental flat. After finishing his other preparations, he stretched out his right hand and slowly and heavily grabbed at the thin air in front of him. He pulled out an ancient brass key from the air. This was the key tool to summon Mr. Dorr, the master key. Right after that, Klein grabbed at the air in front of him solemnly again and pulled out an object from thin air. The item emitted a tranquil glow that was in the shape of the full moon. Embedded around it were a row of scarlet gems. In the middle was a symbol representing the moon and many mysterious patterns. Scarlet lunar corona. It was the scarlet lunar corona that currently belonged to Sharon. It could create the effects of a full moon, allowing the person holding the master key to hear Mr. Dorr's ravings. If he only wanted to hear what Mr. Dorr was shouting, this would have been sufficient. There was no need to hold any more rituals, but his goal was to speak to the King of Angels. Therefore, he had to follow the procedure. After placing the master key in the scarlet lunar corona on the altar, he recalled for a moment and reached out his right hand again, pulling out a handful from thin air. This time, he took out a gorgeous necklace made studded with diamonds and jadeite. My experiences as Dwayne Dantes are rather useful after all. Otherwise, how could I have come into contact with so many female members of high society and dance with them, allowing me to see accessories of different styles and materials? And without such close proximity for observation, how could I easily summon the corresponding historical void images? This can last 15 minutes. That's enough. Having met his simple goal, Klein sighed in satisfaction. Then, he continued to extend his right hand, preparing to gather the 9 gems he needed from the ladies and madams he knew in the past. In a second, his hand stopped in midair and his expression turned odd. I forgot that I can only maintain 3 historical void images. What should I do? Swap this necklace and find an accessory that has at least 9 gems? Let me think about whether I've seen anything like that before. Yes, I can use dream divination to recall. This. Is dream divination meant for times like this? Seer and scholar of yore are quite compatible after all. Well, this is also an extreme form of magic. Amidst his thoughts, Klein was just about to find a chair and do the divination when he suddenly frowned. He realized that something was amiss. Under normal circumstances, it was impossible for him to forget that he could only summon 3 historical void images at the same time. This is a subtle warning from my spirituality. Looking at the master key and the scarlet lunar corona on the altar, he waved his right hand gently, causing them to vanish. Then, he took 4 steps counterclockwise and recited the honorific name. He went above the gray fog and sat at the seat belonging to the fool. He conjured a pen and paper and carefully wrote, "Speaking to Mr. Dorr now is dangerous." This divination was clearly directed at Mr. Dorr, so Klein was bound to suffer a certain backlash effect. However, he had already obtained basic ownership over Sapphira Castle, allowing him to use the power of an angel, so he believed that he could withstand Mr. Dorr. After all, he was exiled and sealed. He removed the spirit pendulum on his left wrist and held it with his left hand, allowing it to hang over the surface of the paper. He closed his eyes and recited the divination statement 7 times in a high-strung manner. Without a sound, a shadow suddenly flashed across his mind. It seemed to completely screen his spiritual perception. He hurriedly opened his eyes and saw that the topaz pendant had shattered into powder. After my initial grasp of Sapphira Castle, some divinations are more concealed. It won't cause any accidents? Yes, is it because my safety is involved in the matter that this has happened, or is it because the gap between me and Mr. Dorr has been narrowed to a certain extent? Of course, this is referring to the Mr. Dorr who is in a sealed state. Or perhaps, the effects of the two combined? The present result shows that speaking to Mr. Dorr holds untenable danger. Why though? Klein frowned, unable to come up with any effective speculations or reasonable explanations. After a while, he leaned back against the high-back chair and shook his head with a sigh. He gave up on his original plan. I can only make more preparations in other areas. With his left hand pressed down, the topaz pendant instantly recovered. After all, it was only a projection above the gray fog. Because of the changes in the divination earlier, Klein made some connections. Perhaps prying into the secrets of the twisted and translucent maggots on the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range might not be as dangerous as before. That's highly likely to be a sequence 1 angel of the Antigonus family. It might even be the half-fool that Leonard mentioned to me. If my prying can hold on for a while longer, I can directly discern the formulas of the sequence 2 miracle invoker or sequence 1 attendant of mysteries. There's only one chance. I don't know what sort of developments would happen when dealing with a crazy monster. I'll wait till I'm completely accustomed to the scholar of your potion before making the attempt. Klein rubbed his temples before disappearing from above the gray fog. After returning to the real world, he wasn't in a hurry to clean up the altar. Instead, he sat down and seriously considered what other abnormal preparations he could make. The so-called normal ones were, meeting Queen Mystic once to discuss the details of the cooperation, give Septon, Rionette Tynker, Palaz Zoroast more gifts, pray to the Evernight goddess and increase the chances of summoning the ascetic, Ariana's historical void image, familiarizing himself with the core powers of Scholar of Yore. As for the abnormal ones, it was purely based on Klein's own imagination. After some thought, Klein's expression turned solemn. He frowned slightly and reached out his right hand to grab the air. This time, he didn't drag anything out. Klein did it another 10 times, but all of them met with failure. He had no choice but to accept a fact: it was impossible to succeed purely by relying on himself. He then took out his wallet and took out a paper crane. On the surface, he wrote with a pencil, "Give me some luck. I'll bring you some ice cream from the Srenzo restaurant." After folding the paper crane, he entered the room and lay down on the bed. He restored his spirituality by sleeping. In his hazy dream, he saw thin, silver snakes forming a response. 5. No problem. Klein smiled and made a promise. At the next moment, he woke up. He sat up and reached out his right hand again, grabbing a total of 10 times. He still met with complete failure. I can't do it even if I'm lucky enough. It's too difficult. Klein subconsciously wanted to use his finger to wrap the edge of the bed, but he instantly restrained himself. It was a habit of his above the gray fog, so it wasn't suitable for him to bring it to the real world. After pacing back and forth for a long time, he seriously considered all kinds of connections. Finally, he left the bedroom and went to the altar outside, which had yet been tidied up. He brought an item back to the real world. It was an ancient book made of goatskin with a dark brown cover. Grosel's Travels. Picking up the book, he took a deep breath, half-closed his eyes as if sensing something. Slowly, he reached out his right hand and grabbed very lightly. Failure. Another grab. It was still a failure. After 5 consecutive failures, Klein's actions became even slower, as though he was taking out a piece of charcoal from a glowing red stove. Suddenly, the muscles on his arm tightened and he carefully pulled back. His right hand slowly retracted, slowly dragging out a rather dull, ancient-looking quill. This came from Revival Square of the southern continent's West Balam's northern state, right beside Ince Zangwil's corpse. This was 0-08 before Amon's brother picked it up. Chapter 1143 Reasonable Development. I can only maintain it for about a minute or so. That's way too short, isn't it? A thought flashed through Klein's mind. Without thinking about anything else, he took 2 steps to the desk. He put down Grosel's Travels and quickly wrote on a piece of paper with 0-08, George III plans to use this speech to bait out all his enemies who want to sabotage his ritual. However, if everything goes smoothly and nothing happens, he'll take the opportunity to consume the potion and reveal his trump card to aim for divinity. After all, there are too many unknowns in the future, making it unsafe. Furthermore, he has made appropriate preparations for the ritual, they're already prepared to an adequate level. This is a very reasonable development. After Klein wrote the last sentence, and before he could check if there was anything wrong with the written content, the dim quill in his hand disappeared without a trace, as though it had never existed. And those few words seemed to drain all of his energy, making him feel dizzy. He took a few steps back and collapsed into his chair. It doesn't make sense. It wasn't exhausting for Ince Zangwil back then. It should be because I forcefully summoned it, and I didn't dare let 0-08 weave a story on its own. When I wrote on the piece of paper, I had to rely on my own spirituality to support it. As for Ince Zangwil, he could get 0-08's cooperation, so it wasn't that draining. Klein closed his eyes and used cogitation for a while before feeling better. Under normal circumstances, having had no physical contact with 0-08 and merely meeting it once had made it impossible for him to summon this grade 0 sealed artifact. However, on the one hand, he had the Snake of Fate to personally augment his luck, and on the other hand, he had Grosel's Travels. This was the item left behind by the Dragon of Imagination Enkwelt. Inside it was the City of Miracles, Liveseed. It had a connection to a certain degree to an existence like 0-08. If it wasn't for some high-level existence's disruption, these 2 items would have long been reunited. Klein didn't know if this fate and particular connection could increase the chances of a successful summoning. He only wanted to give it a try since he didn't stand to lose anything. To his surprise, he really succeeded. And it was precisely because of this that he didn't dare to use Grosel's Travels to bear the contents of 0-08's projection. He didn't even dare to let them come close, afraid that something irreversible would happen. This was Backland, which had an extremely dense population. Yes, logically speaking, there shouldn't be any accidents. After all, 0-08 is a historical void projection. It's fake. Grosel's Travels was conjured by the Dragon of Imagination, and it's also fake. A fake combination can't be real in any way. They lack the foundation of a beyonder characteristic. I can go back to the uninhabited Reef Island to test it. Klein rubbed his temples and returned to the desk. There, he began reading what he had just written. He didn't directly write that George III would be unsuccessful in his advancement and die on the spot. He believed that if he interfered with a sequence 1 angel, the projection of 0-08 wouldn't be able to be so direct. He had to be more tactful. Furthermore, there was also the psychology alchemists and Amon's brother. Overly obvious effects would definitely be detected and easily made use of. All he could do was beat about the bush to mitigate the unknown. I hope it works. After staring at it for a while, he folded the piece of paper and stuffed it into his pocket. Then, he sacrificed Grosel's travels back above the gray fog. After doing all of this, Klein began to consider another problem. It was when he would head out to buy some ice cream for Wuxia. Backlund has Zeradal, and it's very possible that Amon is there. If I head out too frequently, we might run into each other. It's a little dangerous. Why don't I summon some ice cream for Will from the historical void? It's very real when eating it, and it'll disappear in 15 minutes. There's no need to worry about gaining weight at all. It's just splendid. Klein couldn't help but mumble inwardly. In the end, he decided to change his clothes and leave the house because he had to keep his promise. Saturday morning, the sky was gray and misty. It made one feel inexplicably stifled. This was a common scene in Backlund's deep winter. Although the smog wasn't as thick and pungent like last year, the geographical environment and climate characteristics had determined that such situations would definitely exist for a long period of time. Furthermore, victory over environmental pollution was never something that could be declared in a year or two. After putting on a black coat that covered her knees, and a black veil hat, Melissa quickly walked to the door. Benson held his hat and shook his head. A young girl who isn't even 20 years old should be dressed like a teenager. You look overly mature and old-fashioned in that, understand? Old-fashioned. Melissa glanced at her brother and simply replied, "The price of a pound of bread has risen by a quarter pence." "This price," Benson said. He then took out a silver pocket watch covered in vine leaf patterns and snapped it open. "Let's go. There's still a long way to go to the municipal square." Melissa tersely responded and went out into the streets with her brother. "Good morning, Mrs. Daniel." After taking a few steps forward, Benson saw a neighbor leaving. He greeted her with a smile. He was good at chatting and had long established a good relationship with his neighbors. The lady named Mrs. Daniel wore a pure black dress. She was in her 40s and had a thin face. Her face was covered in a thin black veil that hung down from her hat. When she heard the greeting, she nodded and replied simply, "Good morning, the two of you." She didn't make any small talk, and she coldly walked away. As he watched her back, Benson deliberately slowed down his pace. When they finally opened up a distance, he turned to ask his sister, "What happened to Mrs. Daniel?" "I've been too busy recently, so I haven't visited the neighbors in a long time." Melissa pursed her lips and said, "Mrs. Daniel's eldest son was confirmed to have died on the front line at the Amantha mountain range. News from yesterday. That tall, bashful, but thoughtful, kind, and sincere young lad? When he came back the last time, he said that he was promoted in the army and became an officer," Benson asked in surprise. Melissa nodded. "I couldn't imagine that Larry would die just like that, just like how she couldn't imagine the tragic deaths of her classmates at school. In just a few seconds, some people could no longer speak, communicate, or study." Benson was silent for a moment before sighing. "I've been busy lately. Actually, I've been dealing with bereavement payments, but perhaps the list I received didn't include Larry, so I'm not sure. There's a lot of information on that list. Some are cheerful, others are humorous, others are the only child within a family. Some are determined, while others are the leaders of the soldiers around them. Some just got married and don't have children. Some are preparing presents for their youngest daughter, while others had love letters with them. They planned on sending it at the post office after the battle. But, they're all dead. Melissa and Benson fell silent at the same time, and neither of them spoke for a long time. When they were almost at the intersection, Melissa looked at the road ahead and said in a low voice, "What do you think His Majesty will be talking about in his speech today? Perhaps it's a form of musters, or perhaps it's to convey the faith that we will prevail," Benson said in passing. Melissa turned to look at her brother. "This isn't like you, Benson. Shouldn't you be making some snarky remarks? It should wait till the speech is heard and the specific content is understood. The most basic principle of being a person is to not make comment on things that one doesn't know enough of. Otherwise, they would be worse than a curly-haired baboon," Benson said with a smile. At this moment, he saw another neighbor. The other party's hair was white, and his face was half covered with a scarf. He was wearing a thick jacket and was holding a cloth bag in his hand as he hurried past the siblings. "Mr. Thomas's dressing is so strange. Does he still need to do something else?" Benson looked at the back of the man and asked in puzzlement. Melissa replied in a low voice, "Mrs. Thomas is sick, and that spent quite a bit of their family's savings. Recently, with food prices sharply increasing while Mr. Thomas's income remains the same, he has to queue up at the soup kitchen every few days to get some bread. He's a decent gentleman, so he probably doesn't want others to recognize him. Also, the food at the soup kitchen is always limited. If one's late, there might not be any left. They'll have to go to the cathedral, the workhouse, and other places. The handouts just happened to start after His Majesty's speech, so Mr. Thomas probably wants to go there directly." Benson nodded slowly and asked in concern, "What's wrong with Mrs. Thomas?" "I know a few good doctors." "A disease caused by anxiety," Melissa explained what she had heard. "Mrs. Thomas is very worried about her youngest child who's serving in the army." "You mean Thomas Jr.?" Benson frowned slightly. After receiving his sister's confirmation, he fell silent, as if recalling something. After a while, when they approached the nearest municipal square, Benson looked ahead and whispered, "Thomas Jr. is already dead." Melissa didn't respond, but her expression was a little dazed. They walked forward silently, as if they were relying on inertia. More and more people appeared in front of them. These people were either dressed in formal attire or holding canes, dressed up as gentlemen. Otherwise, they were dressed in blue, green, yellow, and red-colored skirts, sweaters and leather jackets matched with pants, or dark-colored petticoats. Their colors were dull. They came out of their houses and from the streets they were on, like water droplets splashing upward. They merged together at the intersection, forming a tiny stream. The stream surged ahead, combining with other tributaries, and flowed into the square's entrance, interweaving into a majestic torrent. The torrent slowly surged forward, flooding the square. Amidst this torrent of humans, Melissa felt like she was as puny as a water droplet. Chapter 1144. Narrowly due to the fact that they had arrived early, the seats that Melissa and Benson could choose from weren't too bad. They could directly see something strange on the grayish-white stone pillars in the middle of the square. Its two heads dramatically differed in size and were painted with dark blue paint. It was connected to some cables. At the foot of the object was a troop of soldiers in red shirts and white pants. They were carrying grayish-white metal backpacks, as well as complicated structures and small-caliber rifles. They were watching their surroundings in high alert. As more and more citizens gathered, the square began bustling with activity. At 9 o'clock sharp, the strange object on the stone pillar suddenly produced sizzling sounds. Finally, it changed into a deep and thick voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your emperor, ruler of Lone, East Balam, and Rorstad Archipelago, George Augustus III, that thing can talk. It's using the principles behind the telegram." Melissa's eyes widened as her attention shifted from the speech to the strange thing. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your emperor, ruler of Lone, East Balam, and Rorstad Archipelago, George Augustus III. At Memorial Square in Westboro, Audrey accompanied her father, mother, and elder brother near the platform. She looked at the king in his formal attire as she attentively listened to his speech. As she knew in advance what George III would be focusing on today, and the mood that would be created, Audrey didn't wear anything that she was fond of. Be it the colors or style, they were nothing a girl would wear. It was the same as the Earl's wife, Caitlin. The dress was simple and conservative. It was black in color without any traces of accessories. I'm very happy but also feel heavy-hearted to tell everyone that we've finally stopped the first stage of the Faceation attacks. We've foiled their plans of annihilating Lone within 3 months. But many outstanding young people have already died at the front lines and died in this war. They had a better future ahead of them. They should have accompanied their parents in growing up, aging together with their spouses, and allowing their children to grow up in a loving environment and have a good childhood. The Faceations have destroyed everything. Knowing why this war had started, Audrey wasn't incited by the king's speech. She only felt that he definitely had talent in inciting drama. She heard slight sobbing sounds coming from the crowd around her. She could feel the sadness rising bit by bit as they intertwined and brewed. Her eyes reddened uncontrollably. The king's speech was very fake, but the sorrow of the people was real. In particular, Audrey had seen many family members who had been killed, having helped those who had lost their children, husbands, and father overnight. This is a great resonance of emotions, the best place to consume the manipulator potion. Audrey suddenly came to a realization, but she was unable to make use of it because, not only had she not digested the Dreamwalker potion, but she had yet to provide enough contributions to Mr. World. She slowly took a deep breath and controlled her emotions. She shifted her gaze away from King George III and let her thoughts wander. Mr. World is very concerned about today's speech. I wonder how he's going to exploit this. I hope it won't lead to a serious accident. That thing called a radio broadcast is based on the principles of wireless radio transmission. Mr. World mentioned that certain factions at sea have already put such technology to use. Compared to the sea, which is constantly affected by storms, something like this is clearly more suitable for use on land. As the thoughts flashed through her mind, the stern and old-fashioned George III finished the first part of his speech and solemnly said, "Let us mourn for our heroes here. Ladies and gentlemen, recite this together with me in your hearts. In the name of Emperor George III, I wish for the dead heroes to be at peace. I hope they will become eternal in the kingdom of the deity they believe in." This sentence carried an indescribable sense of dignity, making everyone, including Audrey, involuntarily lower their heads, clasp their hands, and silently recite, "In the name of Emperor George III. In the name of Emperor George III." On the other side of Memorial Square, Klein, who was wearing a black coat and an ordinary face, stood and prayed with the crowd around him at the same time. He appeared completely normal. After 3 minutes of silence, he used an avian marionette standing on the roof of a nearby building to carefully observe George III's every move in an attempt to find a sign that the king was about to quietly leave and enter the mausoleum to consume the potion. According to Klein's understanding, the "In the name of Emperor George III" segment was core to the entire Black Emperor ritual. If one were to consume the potion, it would definitely happen at this moment, or within 2 to 3 minutes after the collective mourning. The effects would likely be lacking if there was any delay. George III is also silently mourning. He isn't doing anything else. Klein held back his impatience and puzzlement as he patiently waited. Tears streamed down many people's faces as the mourning gradually came to an end. Everyone opened their eyes one after another. At this moment, George III didn't do anything. He spoke again and continued his speech. "We've already endured through the most difficult part. We'll definitely defeat this evil and brutality. This is the power of justice. This is the power of every soldier at the front lines. This is the power of every factory worker, this The arrangement by 0-08 wasn't successful. George III has no intention of becoming a god today. He's just trying to bait any enemies who want to destroy his ritual. In any case, he can still give many more speeches like this in the future. Klein frowned slightly as thoughts flashed through his mind. Suddenly, his expression turned solemn as he thought of a possibility. In the blink of an eye, Klein switched places with Anuni, who was hiding in the sewers. The latter was dressed the same as him, and his external appearance looked identical to him. Following that, Klein took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the gray fog. With the help of the crimson star representing Miss Justice, he used his true vision to observe the situation in the square. He was already a sequence 3 beyonder, so there was no need for him to use the Sea God Scepter to widen his field of view. Of course, compared to a scholar of yore, a Sea King's true vision was obviously much larger. However, there was no need for that. The moment his gaze landed on the stage where King George III was giving his speech, his gaze froze. There was no one there, or rather, there was only a fake phantom. It was an imagined George III giving the speech. Before the speech, Klein had been wary of this problem. He had specially observed and confirmed that it was the real George III. Who knew that, within a few minutes, the real George III would become an imaginary George III? In the midst of his silence, he had used the Black Emperor Pathway's powers to distort and silently swap himself with a substitute. George III should have already entered a secret mausoleum and is consuming a potion in an attempt to advance. With a thought, he quickly checked the surrounding area and discovered that there was something abnormal beneath the platform. Boundless black energy was secretly emanating from there. He then picked up the Black Emperor card on the surface of the long bronze table and tried sensing it. Using the law of convergence of beyonder characteristics, he confirmed that the power belonged to the Black Emperor Pathway and came from distortion powers. Impressive. While using a speech to bait the enemy, he disguised himself as a fake person and secretly left to consume the potion. There's not much time left. Klein's heart tightened as he immediately returned to the real world. In the sewers, he recited in Jotun, the sacred spirit that pursues knowledge, the mysterious world's lighthouse, eyes that pry into fate, the royalty above the sea, the pure and holy Bernadette Gustave. This was the honorific name of Queen Mystic, but it was somewhat different from a normal sequence 3's. Its range was very large and was effective all across Backland. With regards to this, Klein suspected that the eldest daughter of Emperor Roselle had used a Grade 0 sealed artifact to achieve this effect. Bernadette rarely told her honorific name to anyone, afraid that some enemies would use the prayer and automatic response property to lock onto her position before she reached sequence 2. This was very similar to what Klein had thought of. Klein had come to an agreement with her that, as long as he recited her honorific name, she would choose any secret mausoleum and open the door with the symbol drawn by the blood in an attempt to destroy it. Both of them didn't have any hopes of success, because the guards in the mausoleum would definitely chant the honorific names of the angels every once in a while, causing a situation that allows them to see the corresponding areas through the prayer point of light. Once they discovered something amiss, they would immediately rush over to help. Bernadette's main purpose was to attract attention. Of course, if those angels were to arrive at a slower pace, Queen Mystic could also go from providing support to being the main offensive force. After doing this, Klein immediately stretched out his right hand to grab the air. As his arm pulled back, a figure appeared in front of him. It was a woman with average facial features and dark eyes. She wore a simple robe and a tree bark belt. Her raven-black hair hung down as she stood bare feet without any shoes or socks. The Evernight Cloister's matron, the ascetic leader, the servant of concealment, the grounded angel, Ariana. I succeeded in one try. Klein was shocked, but he didn't think too much about it. He quickly said, "Keep my existence concealed and protect the people of Backland." He was worried that after George III lost control due to the destruction of his ritual, he would rush out of the mausoleum and harm the people of this city. "All right," Ariana replied with a calm expression. She wasn't rigid or stiff at all. "It can't be her in person, right? Actually, my summoning wasn't successful, but the goddess had already gotten Ma'am Ariana to secretly return to Backland. The moment she sensed that she had been summoned, she came over. An angel of the concealment domain also has a certain degree of control over their historical void image." As a thought flashed through his mind, he realized that he had entered a special state, no longer being sensed by the outside world. Chapter 11:45 3 Arrows. At the same time, Klein didn't have the time to think about such trivial matters. After having his existence concealed, he immediately got Inuni to switch places with a new marionette who was formerly a pirate. Immediately following that, he activated Creeping Hunger and brought Inuni and Konas to the secret mausoleum in Awa County. As he could only maintain 3 images from the historical void at the same time, it was impossible for him to abandon his marionette and directly come over by using a summon projection. It would occupy a crucial spot. As for the remaining marionettes in Memorial Square, they wouldn't die on the spot in half an hour. They would only appear to be in a daze. However, this wasn't something that would attract too much attention while listening to a speech. Finally, if he didn't return, the Red Gloves team from the Church of Evernight would clean up his tracks. At the same time, outside the secret mausoleum in Eastchester County, there was a young lady in a yellow layered dress and a black, old-fashioned bonnet. Pea vines grew out of nowhere as they appeared. Her chestnut hair cascaded down naturally. Her eyebrows were long and straight, and her eyes appeared as though they were filled with a blue sea. Looking at the mountain wall in front of her, Queen Mystic extended her right hand and quickly formed a symbol in the void. Following the movement of her fingertips, drops of bright red blood that resembled shattered gems seeped out and froze in midair. Soon, a complicated symbol formed from layers of doors appeared. They trembled slightly and seemed to resonate with something somewhere else. In the blink of an eye, the blood-colored symbol extended into an illusory translucent door. Through it, one could vaguely see a gigantic mausoleum formed from black rocks. Bernadette immediately walked through the illusory door and arrived inside a dim and dark area. The light here came from the lights of stone pillars and strange underground moss growing on the cliff walls. Together, they illuminated the secret mausoleum in the light fog at the bottom. The symbol provided by Mr. Door was really useful. At this moment, as a ritual was being held deep underground, faint lights gathered, forming a figure midair in the darkness. The figure had a square face, black hair and blue eyes, a high nose bridge, and a thick beard. He looked rather solemn. His appearance and image wasn't unfamiliar to many citizens of the Lone Kingdom. This was because he had been printed on the front side of 10-pound notes. Of course, people who had never touched 10-pound notes in their entire lives could also see his statue or portraits at Memorial Square. He was the Lone Kingdom's founder and protector, the first king, William Augustus I. This was an entity referred to as he. With the help of the ritual, he had come here directly from Backland. Bernadette remained impassive. With a flip of her hand, a new item appeared. The item was golden in color, like a miniaturized water flask. However, a candlewick extended out from the mouth of the flask. As Bernadette caressed the surface of the item with her right hand, one that was covered in mysterious and complicated symbols, the candlewick silently ignited. The light it emitted was like a sticky water stream that sprayed upwards, forming a blurry and twisted golden figure. Eternal Genie of the Lamp, my second wish is to obtain the strength of a knowledge emperor for one day. Seizing the opportunity when William Augustus I had yet to fully descend, Bernadette spoke in a solemn voice. The item in her hand was called Magic Wishing Lamp. It might have come as early as the first epoch. Although it had never been obtained by the 7 churches, it had the corresponding Grade 0 sealed artifact number. 0-05. This item could grant its owner any 10 wishes, but this was either done in a distorted form, or it came with unpredictable and terrifying outcomes. None of its previous owners had a good ending, including Roselle Gustave. This emperor had warned his daughter that she could use the proper choice of words and make preparations to avoid the harm brought about by the first 2 wishes, but she absolutely couldn't make the 3rd wish. Absolutely not. Meanwhile, the concealed Klein arrived near the secret mausoleum in Awa County without alerting anyone. Although time was tight, he didn't rashly approach the mausoleum by drawing the symbol and opening the door. Instead, he reached out his right hand and grabbed at the air in front of him. After 5 consecutive attempts, the muscles on his arms suddenly tightened, as if he was pulling something extremely heavy. As he retracted his right hand, a figure quickly appeared. The figure's skin was bronze in color. He had a medium build, black hair, brown eyes, and soft facial features. Beneath his right ear was a very thin mole. It was none other than Isaac Eggers. However, unlike the Mr. Isaac that he knew, the figure's gaze was cold. He wore a deep black robe embroidered with golden threads. He wore a golden bird-shaped crown, as though he was looking down on all living creatures. This was the former Death Consul, a former Sequence 2 angel. Without sizing him up further, Klein reached out again and grabbed into the void. This time, he didn't seem to have pulled anything out, but in fact, he had summoned the former him from 10 seconds ago, the him who was in a concealed state. Then, Klein threw a small metal bottle at his projection and made himself enter the gray fog's historical void. In his past self, his consciousness suddenly came alive and became extremely agile. This concealed Klein brought the projection of Death Consul Isaac and came to the secret mausoleum where the entrance couldn't be seen. He took out a small metal bottle and used his spirituality to draw with the blood that shimmered like gems. In midair, he quickly outlined the symbol that Mr. Door had given. The symbol rapidly formed and resonated with a particular point in the mausoleum, expanding into an illusory door. In a concealed state, Klein and Death Consul Isaac passed through the door and entered the corresponding secret mausoleum. At that moment, the guards inside had already discovered that there was an intruder and had activated the ritual they had prepared in advance. However, all they could see was the lofty Death Consul. Somewhere in Backlund, the former Duke of Southville, Dlink Augustus, was just about to use a ritual to open a passageway and descend into that secret mausoleum when a man beside him suddenly frowned and said, "That's Isaac Eggers." "No, he is very rigid. It's like a historical projection summoned by the Secret Order's scholar of Your Highness, let me go over. Stay here and be wary of the scholar of Your who's lurking in the dark. Although they aren't angels, they're quite troublesome." Dlink Augustus was a slightly arrogant elder. His black hair was mixed with silver threads, and he was clean-shaved. Upon hearing that, he laughed and said, "Isn't the scholar of Your just beside him? Although he's in a concealed state, I've already discovered him through the disorder of the surrounding area. He's misleading us, making us think that he's deliberately attacking with a historical projection while his true body has gone elsewhere. In fact, he's hidden beside Isaac's projection. Once this Death Consul attracts the attention he wants, and when we place our main forces elsewhere, he'll use the concealed state to approach the mausoleum to cause destruction. Besides, regardless of the reason, since he's summoned an angel's projection, you won't be able to kill the target in a short period of time even if you carry a Grade 0 sealed artifact. If this implicates the mausoleum, our efforts and persistence would have been in vain. If that scholar of yours has done 3 levels of misdirection and really went to another mausoleum, he won't be able to summon an angel from the historical void. You can easily eliminate him." While he said his first sentence, Dlink Augustus had already entered the passage through the ritual's activation. The rest of his words were spoken by the phantoms that he had left behind. Inside the secret mausoleum in Awa County, Isaac Eggers scanned the area with an indifferent expression. His body suddenly swelled and transformed into a giant serpent that covered the area above the mausoleum. This giant serpent was both illusory and real, as though it was formed by something incomprehensible to humans. Its entire body was covered with huge dark green scales. White feathers grew out from the gaps, and each scale and feather had strange symbols of different shapes. Just the mere sight of them made one's flesh decompose, turning them into zombies. This was Quetzalcoatl, the serpent spoken of in southern continent myth. His eye sockets were burning with pale white flames as an exaggerated, thick pair of wings spread from his back. Amidst the howling wind, the feathered serpent in midair lunged forward with its upper body and spat out a pale white flame that covered the entire mausoleum. Mr. Azek's historical void projection is definitely much weaker than before, but it's still very powerful. As expected of the biological son of death, the consul of the Balam Empire. Although the concealed Klein had done a summoning experiment previously at sea, he never expected that Azek's projection would be so powerful. At that moment, points of faint, gloomy glows flew out of the mausoleum, putting an end to the tidal-like pale white flame's advancement. Following that, they formed a figure. It was none other than the Sequence 2 balancer, Blink Augustus. The moment the concealed Klein saw him, he suddenly turned rigid and stiff. He began acting based on instinct, a result of him returning to the historical void and being outside the secret mausoleum. Then, he teleported to a secret mausoleum under the Tussock River and took out another small metal bottle. In a concealed state, he used his spirituality to draw the blood out to outline the symbol. A few seconds later, the symbol resonated and turned into a door. With his marionettes, Konas and Inuni, he walked in. Of course, in the river and forest outside, he still had marionettes he just converted. A figure appeared near the ruins number 1 in the outskirts of Backlund. Her raven hair was radiant, and her face was slightly round. She looked beautiful, with a hint of sweetness and an outstanding bearing. She was none other than Demonis Trissi. After Trissi approached ruins number 1, she also took out a small metal bottle and drew the symbol provided by Mr. Door with the blood. An illusory door rapidly took shape. Chapter 1146. A real charlatan. As she passed through the illusory door, Trissi hid herself and jumped down from the cliff at the entrance, towards the dark valley below. The secret mausoleum that originated from Blood Emperor Tudor was hidden here. During the descent, Trissi's body was as light as a feather. She lost most of her weight, but her speed was in no way slow. None of the remaining guards noticed that she had sneaked in. Just as Trissi was approaching her target, she heard a voice say, "Concealment is prohibited here." Trissi's figure instantly appeared out of nowhere. And in the area above the towering mausoleum in the dark valley, there was a man who had appeared at some point in time. This man had a long, rectangular face with a white hairband on his head. He had a mustache that curled up around his mouth, and his brows were extremely thick, setting off his relatively large eyes. He was dressed in formal attire and wore a cloak. The tips of his shoes were extremely long, and his attire didn't seem to match the times. He was the demigod who supported George III, Prince Grove. On the head of this Sequence 3 Chaos Hunter, there was a crown made of thorns. Pure light constantly gathered into the crown, interweaving into a sealed artifact 0 to 36. Klein swam beneath the Tussock River when an image suddenly appeared in his mind just as he led his marionette, Konas and Inuni, through the illusory door. A black cathedral stood in front of them with its spacious door opened, revealing a man in a pair of dungarees, a gentleman in a formal suit and top hat, a lady with frilly designs along her sleeves, and a lady whose dress formed flowers with laces. They were suspended in midair, motionless. Caw! 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 Black ravens circled the top of the cathedral, letting out heart-stopping cries. Without making any guesses, Klein felt like he had fallen into a crack on a frozen lake. His body turned cold as his hair stood on end. Countless thoughts surged in his mind as they collectively shouted out a name, Zeradal. In the blink of an eye, Klein instinctively made a decision. He planned to switch locations with his marionettes from the outside world, and directly leave the cathedral in front of him. Clearly, he had encountered a miracle. He didn't enter George III's secret mausoleum after passing through the illusory door. Instead, he had come to a baffling place. In the next second, he discovered that the spirit-body threads that were connected to his marionettes had been severed. They were rapidly floating upwards towards the interior of the pitch-black cathedral. If it wasn't for his intuition that exceeded his own level, allowing him to detect danger ahead of time, he definitely wouldn't have been able to react in time. He definitely would have been hung up and become a member of the marionettes. He didn't have time to think too much about it. He quickly controlled his spirit-body threads and collected them all, connecting them to himself, forming one circle after another. This allowed him to temporarily extricate himself from the danger, but it also made him lose his marionettes, Konas, and Inuni, in just a second. The two marionettes' necks suddenly tightened as they were lifted up by an invisible hand before being hung up in the cathedral's interior. Together with the original corpses, they swayed in the wind and produced voices that were different but said the exact same thing: "Welcome back." In Memorial Square, the imagined King George III was still giving a speech. "I will further lower the wealth requirements needed for election eligibility. I will hand over even more rights to the House of Commons." Although the people didn't understand why there was such a development in the speech, it sounded good to them. "These are all bills that have been approved by the House of Lords, but there's no need to tell the public during this speech. It's like the king is emphasizing that he will definitely follow these bills in the future." Audrey was puzzled, but she couldn't come up with a convincing explanation. In the dark and majestic secret ruins No. 1 in the outskirts of Backlund, the real George III had already worn a black crown and consumed the potion. His body was transforming towards the shadow of order, extending in a magical state. As for the 9 mausoleums, they were the islands in the sea of nothingness. They were the components of his entire rule. As for the people who were chanting Emperor George III at the same time during the ritual, there were like countless numbers of lighthouses. Together, they anchored this ruler of Lone, East Balam, and the Rørsted archipelago, making him completely transcend reality and become a part of the shadow of order. During this process, George III's thoughts wandered uncontrollably as though they were being torn apart. The secret order's Zeradal actually contacted me directly, hoping to provide me with help. He said that he saw some of Gehrman Sparrow's thoughts from the Capim case, the attack on Ailment Maiden, the silencing of Crazy Captain, and Konas Kilgore's disappearance. And his divination results made him cooperate with me, offering to help me guard a mausoleum. There, he waited for Gehrman Sparrow to take the initiative to walk to him, because of his own goals and the law of convergence of beyonder characteristics. He also said that the most important thing to do when dealing with a qualified demigod of the seer pathway is to be patient and determined. What a charlatan. He even brought Abomination Sua. I used my powers to sign a contract with them. Together with the helpers I invited from the Twilight Hermit Order, as well as Grove, who wields a Grade 0 sealed artifact. Even if most of the demigods of the military and royal family are fighting at the front lines or protecting Backlund, I don't have to worry about the ritual being destroyed. Unless a true deity descends into the real world. And that's impossible. So, I originally wanted to use this opportunity to lure out any resistance, but in the end, I decided to use this opportunity to directly advance. Heh, since Grove still doesn't know about these hidden cards. Well, he has no right to know. In less than 2 minutes, I'll become an eternal god, the Black Emperor who rules over reality. Caw. 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 In the dark world with the ravens cawing, the corpses hanging from the black top of the church descended and passed through the main door. Their eyes were locked onto Klein, who was outside. Almost at the same time, a figure slowly but firmly outlined itself in midair. Without caring about what it was, Klein quickly snapped his fingers while maintaining the special state of his spirit-body threads. Pa! A red flame surged out from his wallet and instantly enveloped him. The flame was quickly extinguished, and Klein remained where he was, unable to leap out. He didn't show any signs of being depressed as he immediately activated creeping hunger to attempt to teleport. Klein instantly turned transparent as he appeared again, unable to take a single step. His origin and destination had strangely been connected. At that moment, the figure in midair had already taken form. He was dressed in gorgeous clothes, with long chestnut-colored curly hair, blue eyes, high nose bridge, and thin lips. He was none other than the Roselle Gustav from when he was an emperor. He looked down at Klein as countless illusory symbols appeared in his eyes. Klein's mind instantly swelled as he was injected with a large amount of unknown knowledge. His head felt like it was exploding in an instant while his other thoughts were completely occupied, so much so that he couldn't even lift a finger. Instinctively, he allowed that knowledge to split up and become injected into hundreds of worms of spirit. This allowed him to regain his ability to control his body as he quickly grabbed the space ahead of him with his right hand. His arms suddenly sank, and then he suddenly pulled back. When the marionettes passed through the cathedral's door and began their attacks, another two figures appeared in midair, dragging out a scaleless, silvery white tail. As he released his right hand, a giant serpent appeared in this dark kingdom. His eyes were bright red and cold, and his body was covered in patterns and symbols. There were countless wheels in the details. Snake of Fate. Actually, this wasn't something that Klein could summon out from the historical void. Instead, it was Will Septon descending with the burning of the paper crane after using the yesterday once more charm. Klein had just used Flaming Jump moments ago to seek help from the Snake of Fate. And the reason why he wanted to grab at something was to conceal his true intentions. It was to prevent the opposing angel from discovering the location of the Snake of Fate, putting Dr. Aaron's family in danger. This wasn't like how he had previously dealt with Amon's avatar back then, as he had no confidence in eliminating all the clues. Therefore, he had discussed with Will in advance on how to deal with such situations. Fortunately, the intent Will Septon expressed indicated that the truth of the summoning from before hadn't been exposed. At that moment, the gigantic snake of Mercury rose up and bit its tail, turning into a mysterious and exaggerated wheel. In midair, two figures appeared on both sides of Roselle's projection. One of them was Queen Mystic Bernadette, whose real body was in an intense battle with Sequence One Hand of Order William Augustus I. The other was formed from pure light, and a pair of shining wings grew on his back. It was obviously at the level of an angel. Suddenly, the two angel projections that appeared quickly vanished. The attacks they directed at Klein, and the controlled marionettes, retreated back into the cathedral and were hung up again. Konas and Inuni walked out one after another. With him, they passed backward through the illusory door and left the world with resonating cawing, appearing beneath the tussock river. Snake of Fate. Reboot. The giant serpent's figure vanished as well. Without any hesitation, Klein activated teleportation and passed through countless spirit world creatures to another secret mausoleum. He used the remaining blood to outline the symbol and opened the illusory door. This time, he entered the interior and saw a solemn and dark mausoleum. He summoned the sea god scepter and released a terrifying lightning storm, again and again, destroying the target. Then, he turned around and left the scene. Everything went so smoothly, just like a dream. Yes, a beautiful dream. Klein, who could always maintain his lucidity in dreams, had realized that he was in a real dream created by someone else the moment he entered the ruins where the secret mausoleum was. Chapter 1147 Chaos. Klein pretended not to notice the real dream. As he tried to stop his projection of the death console, he tried to summon another version of himself from the historical void to fool the guards of the Tudor ruins, allowing his body to escape the dream and sneak into the secret mausoleum to achieve his goal of destroying it. At the moment, he could only maintain 3 historical void projections. Death Consul Azek Eggers was one, his self-projection in a concealed state was another. He couldn't be certain if the leader of the ascetics, Ariana, was considered one. However, to be safe, he had to disperse one of them before he made another summoning attempt. Regarding Ariana's state, apart from suspecting that she had descended in person due to her state, Klein had other theories. Perhaps the leader of the Evernight cloister had deliberately entered a concealed state after sensing that her projection from the past had been summoned while being located in the Amantha mountain range. She had vanished from the real world, allowing the projection to gain sentience. This was completely feasible, especially since the authority of concealment likely gave her a certain degree of control over her historical projections. When it came to a concealment angel like this, Klein was unable to use the feedback from Scholar of Yours maintenance of the historical projection to confirm her true situation. Therefore, he didn't make any changes, so as to prevent any accidents from happening. Just as he was about to summon his past self, the real dream silently disappeared. Everything around him returned to normal. He was standing on a cliff at the entrance. Below him was a dark and majestic mausoleum. An old man with an ordinary appearance was levitating in midair. Under the glow from the moss and the light from the stone pillars inside the cliff, he calmly looked at Klein and sighed in ancient Fasak. "You weren't actually fooled by the dream I crafted." This old man's hair was completely white, but it was thick enough. There weren't many wrinkles on his face, and his appearance wasn't anything special. The Spectator Pathways Sequence 3 Dreamweaver? No, at least, he's not an angel. Klein tensed up and didn't respond. He immediately took out his silver adventurer's harmonica and blew into it. No sound was produced, but Rionette Tynker, who was wearing a dark and complicated long dress, walked out. One of the blonde, red-eyed heads in her hands immediately spat out a rectangular diamond-like charm. Another head chanted in ancient Hermes, "Yesterday. Yesterday once more." Miss Messenger was borrowing strength from her past self. Compared to a sequence 1 Snake of Fate, the power she'd borrowed could last longer. However, the charm didn't change at all. In midair, the elder in the gray robe gently chuckled and kindly reminded them, "Don't use ancient Hermes in front of me." Hermes. This is Hermes, the one who lived since the Second Epoch and created ancient Hermes? An angel of the Spectator Pathway. The origin of the psychology alchemists. Klein was first shocked before he realized something. Hermes was participating in the battle, so it was unlikely he had a strong desire to stop him. No, perhaps he is deliberately acting to lower our guard. Beyonders of the Spectator Pathway are the best at manipulating the hearts of others. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, Rionette Tynker's other 2 heads began chanting in Jotun and Elvish, "Yesterday." The rectangular diamond-like charm was instantly ignited by a transparent flame before fusing with the void. Rionette Tynker's body began to rapidly expand as the 4 heads in her hands flew up and landed on her neck. The 4 heads became illusory one after another. In an instant, Rionette Tynker transformed into a huge cloth doll that resembled a castle. She was dressed in a black Gothic dress with countless mysterious symbols and sinister vines. Her eyes were blood red. She swept his gaze across ancient Hermes. She opened her tightly shut mouth but didn't make a single sound. The Spectator Pathways angel flashed with a faint light, turning into a plump, white rabbit. Ancient Bane, Transformation Curse. The rabbit didn't panic at all. Its body began to swell, becoming half the size of a mountain. One stomp was sufficient to trample him to death. To an angel of the Spectator Pathway, merely believing in their strength allowed them to be powerful enough without being at a disadvantage due to their appearance. As the rabbit turned into a monster, a subtle change happened in the ruins. Reality and illusion intertwined, making Rionette Tinker a little confused as to whether she was in a dream or in the real world. Klein could differentiate between the two. While he had noticed that, not only was Miss Messenger in a mythical creature form, but the surface of the rabbit's body was covered in grayish-white scales. All sorts of patterns intertwined together, forming three-dimensional symbols that seemed to connect to the mind. Angels are truly terrifying. They use their complete mythical creature form right at the start. As Klein sighed, he didn't even dare take a second look to gain more knowledge. Firstly, he didn't have the time to do so, and secondly, his level wasn't high enough. Seeing a complete mythical creature form would definitely lead to being affected and receiving some negative effects. This was something he had to avoid in a dangerous battlefield. Taking advantage of the battle between Miss Messenger and the gigantic rabbit that had transformed into a dragon, Klein used the strong winds to head for the secret mausoleum. As he recited a particular honorific name in Jotun, he reached out to grab at the air. First time, failure, second time, failure, third time, still a failure. Just as one fat, white rabbit after another appeared in Klein's island of consciousness, causing him to elevate his consciousness to fight back and be unable to take multiple things into consideration, he instinctively reached out his right hand and finally touched a particular image in the historical void. As he pulled back his arm, the image quickly outlined itself. She was a woman wearing a dark-colored robe and a wide hood. She had a beautiful face and slightly dull black eyes. This was the concealment angel of the Church of Evernight that he had met before. Later, he found out in the foggy town that this was Mother of the Sky, the daughter of the ancient god, Phlegria, and suspected to be the vessel for the goddess's descent. Since he was able to successfully summon the ascetic leader, Ariana, from the historical void in one try, Klein definitely thought of trying to see if he could summon her. He had been chanting the honorific name of the Evernight goddess. The employing of historical void projections by scholars of yore had a difficult-to-overcome restriction. It was that he was unable to summon something that involved the uniqueness. However, objects that were merely a vessel of a deity's descent depended on how much of the deity's power was carried by the corresponding historical void projection or if it involved the uniqueness. Similarly, if he wanted to summon a mon, it was impossible to summon the actual body, but an avatar would work. To be safe, the person who he summoned was the one who had smiled at him during the Great Smog of Backlund, and he succeeded after 3 attempts. Of course, if it wasn't for the goddess's tacit approval, or perhaps providing some level of help, he might not have succeeded given 100 attempts, 1,000 attempts, or even 10,000 attempts. The beautiful lady didn't look at him, the summoner. Instead, she turned her head and looked down at the secret mausoleum. The entire underground ruin quaked as the dark and majestic mausoleum began to shake. Ripples appeared as though it was about to be moved into a concealed world. At this moment, 2 arms extended out from the outside world. One was pressed towards the gigantic doll, Rionette Tinker, while the other spread out its fingers to grab at Klein. These 2 arms were more than 10 meters long. They were pitch black on the surface, flowing with sticky liquids. Some of them were strangely protruding, some had skulls as heads, 3-dimensional eyes, or barbed tongues. Abomination Sua. The remaining guards in the underground ruins went crazy. Some raised their swords to kill their companions, or they raised their guns, aimed at themselves, and pulled the trigger. Klein's skin began to crack, and his consciousness was disturbed by a sensation of madness. He was unable to respond effectively. The concealment angel he summoned retracted her gaze through pure instinct, and she looked up at the 2 arms that seemed to come from the depths of a nightmare. Tremendous fear caused Sua's arm to tremble slightly. Not only did he fail to grab hold of Klein, he was even cursed by Rionette Tinker, causing him to be covered in green fur. Immediately following that, they began to fade as they struggled with all their might, trying to escape their concealed states. And at this moment, 3 figures appeared in midair in the underground ruins. They were Emperor Roselle, the first lone king, William Augustus, and the abstract angel formed from pure light. The historical void projections summoned by Zeradol followed closely behind. With so many angels descending at the same time, just the effects from their auras alone caused the entire space to quake, not to mention the intense battle they were engaged in. In an instant, the pitch-black mausoleum shook even more vigorously. There was even an obvious crack on its surface. Klein wasn't surprised at all, because this was his last contingency plan. When the enemy was too powerful and prepared, preventing him from creating an opportunity, then it was best to draw everyone together while destroying the mausoleum, thus, creating chaos. This was the inspiration he got from the encounter outside Byam City. Back then, Abomination Sua and the byproduct of the Artificial Death Project attacked remotely while Sea King Kotman, Miss Messenger Rionette Tynker, and a demigod from the Rose School of Thought had participated in it, resulting in the collapse of an innocent mountain. At that moment, Klein wanted the secret mausoleum in this ruin to be like that mountain. He didn't believe that angels could control the damage to their surroundings when in an intense battle. And the lineup this time far exceeded the previous one. It's still not enough. Then let's make it a little more chaotic. As he controlled his spirit body threads to prevent them from floating upwards, he dodged and sensed the mysterious space above the gray fog. Using his basic control over it, he made it tremble slightly. In midair, a grayish-white fog appeared as the majestic palace appeared faintly. Sapphira Castle. In an instant, the sky above the Holy Wind Cathedral in Backlund turned dark, as if a storm was brewing. A bird with dark eye circles watching over the Tussock River downstream moved its gaze. In the outskirts of Backlund where Ruins No. 1 was, Demoness Trissy had been robbed of several powers and suffered serious injuries. She was on the brink of death. Bang! She slammed against the cliff, almost embedding herself into it. Blood was everywhere. At this moment, she took out an item. It was a rectangular diamond-shaped charm. Yesterday once more. Chapter 1148. Not late. There were very few chances to use charms in high-level battles. No one would take the initiative to leave an opening for their opponent while they chanted the incantation. The reason Trissy was able to complete the corresponding action was because she had ignited wicked black flames from the inside out. As for the black flames, they seemed to absorb all the heat in the surrounding areas, causing thick ice crystals to form. Beyond the ice crystals, there were almost invisible spider webs that wrapped around them, forming huge cocoons. Relying on the 3 layers of defense, Trissy managed to buy almost 2 seconds, so she took out the rectangular diamond-shaped charm and chanted, "Yesterday." The transparent flame ignited amidst the wicked black flames. The diamond-like charm silently disintegrated before merging with the void. This was something Klein had specially provided to the Demoness, so as to allow the damage from the 3 prongs to become the main assault point at any time. Trissy immediately saw the grayish-white fog and realized that the scenes in the past were like stars, densely packed together. There were scenes of the young him wandering the streets, coming under the control of the mafia, swindling, cheating, and stealing from others. He later joined the Theosophy Order and became an assassin. There, he enjoyed ending lives and the bloodshed, instigating others to tear off their masks and reveal their true bestial nature. Due to various reasons, he had no choice but to become a witch. She began creating catastrophes and it was arranged by the Demoness of Pleasure that she would become Prince Edisac's mistress. Realizing that she was becoming less and less like herself and that she was slowly losing herself to the pleasure, she felt extreme fear and yearned to escape. However, having fallen deeper into hell, she experienced immense pain and chose to be extreme. With a thought, the scenes magnified and occupied her entire vision. Under the light, the lawn outside the window was bright, and the horses were walking slowly. The holes of the golf course could still be vaguely seen, and inside the house, there was an antique cabinet blocking the view from the door. The past Trissy stood at the edge and looked out, wearing a sapphire ring on her left hand. At that time, she wasn't even a sequence 5, and she didn't have the strength the current her needed to borrow. However, she had a ring from the Demoness sect that was closely related to the primordial Demoness. This ring was the thing that Trissy wanted to borrow. All of a sudden, the intricate ring that was inlaid with a sapphire gem appeared on Trissy's pinky. And unlike in the past, the present Trissy had fused with the mark and submitted to the primordial Demoness. She had been greatly enhanced as a sequence 4 demigod. In other words, even though she wasn't a robust deity's descent vessel, she already had the qualifications to be one. And that sapphire ring allowed her to temporarily grasp a certain amount of initiative. Looking at the scenes in the past, the cocoon formed by Trissy's spider silk cracked inch by inch. The thick ice crystals silently melted as the wicked black flames corroded. She raised her left hand, closed her eyes, and smiled as she placed the sapphire ring between her eyebrows. The ring melted like metal as it flowed into Trissy's head in a surreal manner. At that moment, the wicked black flames were completely deprived by Prince Grove as a burning white spear of light shot out. At the front of the spear, 2 pure white wings spread out as they embraced the tip of the spear, like an angel, sealing off the surrounding space, and preventing the target from escaping. At that moment, Trissy opened her eyes. They were a deep black color. Her hair flared up one by one, each becoming as thick as a snake. The outer layer was slippery and diabolical, with clear black and white eyes embedded at the ends, or heads that looked like venomous snakes. Their mouths were slightly open as they flicked their tongues. The spear that was condensed from pure light stopped in front of Trissy, as though it was being pressed down by an invisible hand, making it difficult for it to advance even an inch further. It quickly turned grayish-white in color, turning from incorporeal to corporeal, as if it was carved out of stone. With a whoosh, the spear rapidly plummeted to the edge of the cliff, shattering into countless tiny pieces. The grayish-white color around Trissy rapidly spread out in every direction as if it had a life of its own. Wherever it passed, the stones became hard while everything else turned to stone. The various rituals that had been set up in Ruins No. 1 were now tainted with grayish-white colors, preventing the angels guarding the other secret mausoleums from discovering the changes and coming over immediately. Prince Grove was instantly surrounded by a grayish-white aura that emanated out of the void. With him only being capable of using the crown of thorns to maintain a small safe zone, there was no way for him to use any prohibition powers. Trissy, whose eyes had no borders marking her whites from blacks, didn't even look at her opponent. With her snake-like hair blotting out the sky, she took a step towards the secret mausoleum at the bottom of the dark valley. Boom! The ground began to shake violently as a dull thud sounded from deep within. Red asteroids with fiery tails appeared out of nowhere as they flew past Demoness Trissy and smashed at the mausoleum. In an instant, this ruin was inundated with catastrophes. George III, who was at the critical moment of his advancement, sensed this and immediately felt a strong sense of confusion and anger. With great difficulty, he split off some of his strength, and with the help of the preparations he had put in place, he forcefully distorted the surrounding area and isolated the dark and solemn secret mausoleum from the real world, preventing earthquakes and meteors from approaching the target. Boom! Boom! Amidst all kinds of catastrophes, the cliffs crumbled one by one as the ruins began to collapse. George III's angry voice sounded from the secret mausoleum that formed a world of its own. Are you mad? For a sequence 4 to forcefully accept the power of a true deity, the only outcome was death. Trissy laughed. The skin on her face had been pushed to its limits. Inch by inch, they crumbled, revealing the blood and flesh that was squirming wildly underneath. This extremely terrifying demonist scoffed and said, "Isn't the ending of a lovely story supposed to have all the bad guys die? For example, you or me." Before Trissy could finish her sentence, she wore that tragic smile on her face as the asteroid plummeted into the twisted secret mausoleum in a bid to destroy it. In another mausoleum, Klein didn't put on a strong front. He quickly ended the connection with Sapphira Castle as though he was praying to the fool for help. The commotion from before had nearly caused all the angels present to stop. Unfortunately, the concealment angel Klein had summoned was a historical void projection. It only continued fighting based on instinct, turning the situation even more chaotic. At this moment, William Augustus I's projection pulled out a silver sword and pointed ahead before slicing downward. There was no need for him to say anything else. The chaos in the ruins came to a stop as the battlefield was divided into different sections. Hermes faced the beautiful and impassive lady. Abomination Sua suppressed Rionette Tynker, the historical void projections of Emperor Roselle and the Angel of Light surrounded Klein. William I stood at an isolated spot, ensuring that none of the aftershocks attacked the mausoleum below. As expected of the Hand of Order, Klein's pupils dilated. Without thinking, he reached his right hand into the inner pocket of his clothes, and he stretched out his left hand to borrow strength from his past self. The Death Consul, the Evernight Cloister's matron, and the Concealment Angel were figures that exceeded Klein's own level. Be it summoning or maintaining them, it was a terrible burden on his spirituality. He had no choice but to borrow some power from his past self before his spirituality completely dried up. This way, he was filled with fake spirituality once more. For the next 5 minutes, it was no different from real spirituality. Then, Klein saw light. The angel formed from pure light, which also had illusory wings on his back, made the layers of light surge towards him like a tidal wave, drowning him. In the bright white sea of light, something suddenly appeared. It rapidly plummeted and approached the secret mausoleum. It was a dark-colored book that consisted of goatskin. Groselle's Travels. Using his ability to split into worms of spirit, and his enhanced ability to shape-shift, he shrank into bookmarks made of flesh, embedding themselves into the book, using it to block the endless light's purification and melting effect. But even so, he was still severely injured because the light still could illuminate part of his body. This wasn't the end. Standing right beneath Groselle's Travels was Emperor Roselle, dressed in gorgeous clothes, waiting there with his hands raised. Without second thoughts, Klein could only activate the first method he knew of to protect himself, hiding in the historical void. Boom! A loud thunderclap boomed outside the ruin. It rumbled in the distance in the beginning, but by the end of it, it was ringing in one's ears. Klein, together with the projections in the historical void, and all the living beings in the ruins were awed and turned stiff. Instantly, the sea of light dimmed. But no, there was a figure that wasn't affected, the Concealment Angel of the Church of Evernight. The beautiful but dull-looking lady took the opportunity to phase her body, transforming into many symbols that symbolized concealment and terror. She extended the strange world, enveloping Hermes, Rionette Tynker, Sua's arm, the Angel of Light, and William Augustus I within. Although Klein had summoned a historical void projection, a watered-down version, some essential parts remained. The chaos that Klein was anticipating was finally here. As for George III's other helpers, such as that King of Angels, they were still in other mausoleums. The moment the nearly transparent world took form, the angels inside began to resist. Amidst the chaos, the strange world easily tore apart. However, with the remnants of the angel's power being directed, the lady rushed out and headed for the secret mausoleum at the bottom. Boom! An even louder clap of thunder rang out. Emperor Roselle, who had attempted to stop them, was once again awed, unable to make any further attempts. In an instant, the dark and majestic secret mausoleum was hit. The cracks on its surface sank deep, causing its dark interior to present itself. In these rifts, blood appeared out of nowhere. Some were bright red, and some were dark. Boom! 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 Having restored his human form, Klein held Groselle's Travels while collectively launching air cannon with his scattered worms of spirit. The mausoleum, which was already on the verge of collapse, had finally collapsed, and even more blood gushed out. With the destruction of a mausoleum, George III's advancement ritual was no longer stable. He lacked the key pillar of support. If only one mausoleum was under attack, he might have been able to rely on his tenuous connection with them to put up a resistance to a certain degree. But now, he had suffered too intense of an attack. His already incorporeal body suddenly boiled, unable to maintain the distortion outside. The mausoleum that was isolated from reality finally appeared in front of Trissy. On Trissy's tendril squirming face, the corners of her mouth curled up. Backland City, Memorial Square. My subjects, the stern and old-fashioned George III with his mustache was finishing his speech when there was a loud explosion. His flesh and blood transformed into a flurry of fireworks that sprayed into the air. Chapter 1149 Escape. When Audrey and company below the platform saw this scene, it was as if they were admiring a large magic show. For a moment, no one realized what had happened. A few seconds later, the scene started to turn disorderly. Amidst screams, the king's guards all rushed up the platform. The cabinet ministers and the House of Lords nobles subconsciously sought a place to hide, or they mustered their courage to follow the guards to check the scene. Audrey looked on in a daze. She wasn't too surprised, but she felt that it was surreal. If Mr. World paid strong attention to someone, it meant that they were being watched by Mr. Fool. And to date, none of Mr. Fool's goals had failed. This was the will of a deity. In the other municipal square in Backland, Melissa, Benson, and company also heard the explosion before realizing that the king's speech had come to an abrupt stop. After a moment of silence, people began to turn rowdy as they began breaking out into a discussion amidst hushed whispers. Fear of the unknown and fear of the future slowly occupied their hearts. In the outskirts of Backland, inside ruins number 1. George III's mind was a blur. He felt something that couldn't be resisted inside his body as a volcano of extreme madness erupted in his mind. It was changing his body while distorting everything around him. Indistinctly, he saw a huge black throne, one which he was sitting on. He wore an emperor's crown, looking down upon the real world with great pride. He had reign over his subjects, and he was equal to the deities. He reached out his hand in an attempt to grab this future, but countless curses and attacks of unknown origins kept striking him. It prevented him from touching that future. No, George III's hand, which had faded, hung in midair as his consciousness tore apart as his body mutated completely. Trissy, who had been reduced to a blob of flesh and blood, enveloped that shadow of order using her countless thick snake hair. Boom! In the outside world, in the area corresponding to ruins number 1, large amounts of dust were stirred up into the sky like the thickest of smog. Boom! The area became a humongous crater that was connected to the Tussock River, opening up an inlet for the river water to rush in. Rumble! High up in the sky, lights dimmed as a storm containing immense horror enveloped the area. Further away on a mountain peak, 2 figures watched this scene without anyone speaking a word. They were the demoness of unaging Katerina, who was wearing a pure white robe, and the pale, hooded red angel evil spirit. After 2 seconds, Saintess of White Katerina sighed softly and said, "The reason we wanted to find her was because Primordial told us that she has strong inclinations towards self-destructing." The red angel evil spirit listened silently as his expression twisted slightly. "I know who interfered with my response." Katerina thought of various answers, but she couldn't be sure. Ultimately, she chose to remain silent. The red angel evil spirit slowly said a word, "Evernight." After a pause, he suppressed his emotions and added, "Otherwise, I would have long found Trissy cheek." Without waiting for Katerina to respond, the red angel evil spirit turned around and left. In another ruin, a hint of joy flashed past Klein's eyes when he saw the secret mausoleum collapse and spill out copious amounts of blood. But it was ephemeral because he had to turn his attention back to his situation. With George III's ritual failing and him not becoming Black Emperor, it meant that his goal had been achieved. What followed next was to escape. At that moment, while the mausoleum's destruction didn't have any significant impact, Rionette Tynker followed her agreement with Klein, and she didn't stay any longer. She first entered the spirit world and fled deep inside it. The power she'd borrowed from herself was coming to an end. The maintenance of the beautiful, concealment angel had already reached Klein's limits. After it transformed into a strange world, it naturally disappeared. Inside the half-collapsed ruin, Klein faced the arm of Abomination Sua, Hermes from an ancient time, Emperor Rozel's projection, William Augustus I's projection, and the Angel of Light projection, as well as the thunder that pointed at an unknown location. Any one of them had the ability to easily kill him. And for him to summon a historical void projection at the angel level wasn't something that could succeed within a few attempts. Without any hesitation, Klein's body turned incorporeal as he attempted to hide in the historical void. At this moment, a vortex suddenly appeared in the grayish-white fog in his vision. It was made up of countless transparent maggots that extended out transparent and slippery tentacles. Zeratul. Zeratul's actual body had appeared. He had been waiting in the historical void for Klein. At that moment, Klein's action of entering the historical void could no longer be reversed. All he could do was watch helplessly as he was pulled in by the vortex and thrown into the center. He wanted to snap his fingers and ignite another paper crane, but he realized that no flames could rise up there. Having probed him once, Zeratul was confident of his trump card. By relying on his level suppressing him, and the authority of bizarreness, he made Klein unable to control the flames anymore. In addition, Klein's intuition told him that the destination after making a teleportation attempt was mysteriously connected to the vortex formed by the transparent maggots. He was unable to escape, nor could he summon enough helpers. However, Beyonders of the seer pathway never perform unprepared. The vortex formed by the transparent maggots slowly spun as it received a visit initiated by Klein. The transparent and slippery tentacles swam over in an unstoppable manner. They reached towards him, but they only wrapped around the ancient book covered in dark-colored skin. The blood on the book's surface hadn't completely faded. Grozel's Travels. At the most dangerous moment, Klein pricked his fingers, allowing his blood to flow onto the surface of Grozel's Travels. Then, with a whoosh, he entered the book world and temporarily escaped the fatal trap set up by Zeratul. The moment he entered the book world, he immediately stretched out his hand and grabbed forward, pulling out a marionette that he had temporarily possessed from the historical void. Vin Rambus. He had once tested that he could summon the projections of true history here. After all, it belonged to Sapphira Castle, and praying to the fool in the book world wasn't obstructed. Of course, if that didn't work, he had other ways to resolve it. He could summon Justice Audrey, who existed in the book world's history. In short, he needed a mid or high sequence beyonder from the spectator pathway to bring him into the sea of collective subconscious, into the city of miracles, Liveseed, and into the hall of truth. Time was of the essence, so the faster, the better. This was because he had no idea how long before this sequence one would be able to grasp the secret of Grozel's Travels, much less whether the other party would forcibly descend into the book world. He could only race against time. Vin Rambus, who was wearing a formal suit and a dark red bow tie, held onto him with a stiff expression. He directly entered the sea of collective subconscious formed by countless shadows. With the power of a manipulator, they quickly shuttled through and arrived at the city of miracles, Liveseed, in seconds, appearing before the entrance of the Hall of Truth. Klein released his control over his marionette, Vin Rambus, and under the nudge from the strong winds, he ran through the door. As he passed by the colorful murals, his inner voice resounded in the hall, "The chances of summoning 0-08 here should be higher. Using it to draw or write at the end of the mural on the left side can affect the real world. Through its arrangements, I can make Zeradal make a mistake, allowing me to find a safe escape route. No, it's still easier to let Amon's avatar join the battle royale and implicate Zeradal. That will be easier to fulfill. It's no wonder the goddess wants to bait Amon into Backlund. The mural on the right represents the book world. I can use 0-08 to draw another temporary door for me to leave. While flying, Klein's right hand kept grabbing at the void ahead. 5 times, 10 times, 20 times. When Klein borrowed strength from his former self, his right hand suddenly sank as he dragged out a dull classic quill. 0-08. In the next second, Klein arrived in front of the huge pillar that was multiple arm spans wide. This had a clear sense of being worn down by time. It was the throne of the dragon of imagination, Ankwelt. Klein circled around the stone pillar and arrived at the end of the mural. He raised the quill, 0-08, and was about to write. He had never tested for any changes when using 0-08 in here before. He was afraid that it would result in an excessive accident and alert Amon's brother, making his ploy of preventing George III from becoming the Black Emperor to be detected in advance. At this moment, he no longer needed to bother about such matters. He could wholeheartedly weave the development that he needed. Suddenly, 0-08, which was about to begin writing, disappeared. It disappeared before it reached the time limit. What's happening? Klein felt alarmed. He then realized that his words in the Hall of Truth hadn't been projected. There was silence all around him. With his spiritual perception triggered, Klein slowly turned around and saw that the time-worn rock had turned into a 100-meter-tall cross at some point in time. In front of the cross was a huge, blurry figure standing there. Facing everything with its back, it was observing all life with compassion. Inside the Hall of Truth, there were rows of black, high-back pews, but only one supplicant. The supplicant had his eyes closed as he sat in the middle of the first row. He wore a rather simple white robe with a pale gold beard that covered half his face. His hands were clasping a silver cross in front of his chest as he wore a genial and calm look. Adam. Twilight Hermit Order's chair, King of Angels Adam. Klein didn't even know when he had arrived. At this moment, Adam looked up, revealing his clear, limpid eyes that resembled a child's. He slowly stood up, speaking with a calm expression. George III's death causes Lone to suffer a heavy blow. Unable to sit idle any further, Intis decides to take this opportunity to launch an attack. This war officially develops into a war that sweeps through the world. Can you accept such an outcome? Chapter 1150 Mad Dash. Although there was no concept of temperature in the Hall of Truth, Klein still felt a chill down his spine when he heard that. He felt a wave of heat, and he wanted to defend himself, but when he opened his mouth, he didn't know what to say. For a few silent seconds, his figure was reflected in Adam's limpid eyes before he said with some difficulty, "I accept it. But I will try my best to minimize the damage caused by the war in the future, so long as I'm still alive." He paused and asked in a deep voice, "Is this the price you exacted for the bestowment? Back when a certain ascetic here mentioned your true name, you had already noticed this book and secretly made arrangements?" Adam, who was dressed in simple white robes, didn't respond. He walked towards the mural on his left and stopped in front of one of the murals. He looked up slightly and quietly admired it. On the mural, a book consisting of goatskin flew up into the clouds and landed in a gigantic claw. After watching for a while, Adam said with a warm voice, "You may leave." He immediately felt that he had been rejected by the Hall of Truth, the sea of collective subconscious of the City of Miracles, and the book world. He involuntarily floated up and flew out of the area. During this process, he saw Adam return to the front of the black pews. Holding the silver cross pendant, he closed his eyes and prayed sincerely to the huge and blurry figure. Outside the sea of collective subconscious, an illusory door silently appeared. It stood in midair and was connected to the outside world. The book world also began to ostracize him, squeezing him out of the huge door. Suddenly, Klein returned to the real world and returned to the grayish-white fog. He was in the state he was in prior to entering the historical void. Unlike before, he hadn't been locked down by the whirlpool formed by countless transparent maggots. As for the slippery tentacles that were almost invisible, they wrapped around Grozel's travel slightly and disappeared into thin air. Without having time to lament over the loss, Klein's thoughts raced, and he made a choice almost purely on instinct. He leaped into the grayish-white fog in another direction and hid in a shattered spot of light. This was the so-called historical void. Klein regretted it the next second because Zeradol's slippery and terrifying tentacles had extended out from the grayish-white fog. The countless translucent maggots were no longer formed a spinning whirlpool as they disintegrated into a tidal wave that surged towards him. Zeradol could actually fight in the historical void. This was the suppression effect that high-level members of the same pathway had against lower-level ones. A demigod of the same seer pathway was always the best choice for dealing with a seer demigod of a lower sequence. Without any hesitation, he ran through the spots of light and into the depths of the fog of history, just like his advancement. Scenes of the secret mausoleum collapsing, Backlund's suffering an air raid, and the tragic Great Smog flew behind him. However, the dangerous premonition in his heart didn't weaken at all, instead, it intensified significantly. He even saw a thick shadow getting closer and closer, covering himself. This was a tidal wave formed by the transparent maggots and the slippery tentacles. Klein ran as fast as he could, constantly chanting the honorific name of the Evernight goddess in Jotun in his mind, hoping to be saved. This was the only thing he could do, and she was the only existence that could save him at the moment. Of course, if he knew of Amon's honorific name, he would definitely attempt to provoke this blasphemer. Only by messing things up would he have a chance of surviving. Rozel's declaration as emperor, the modification of the steam engine, the battle of the violated oath, the White Rose War, and the 20-year war flashed past one by one. Klein realized that his body was being increasingly covered by shadows, and his consciousness was gradually slowing down. He had a feeling that he was having his spirit-body threads controlled. At this moment, hounds of Fulgrim ran out of the grayish-white fog's various spots of light. They were covered in pitch-black short fur, their eye sockets burning with dark red flames as the corners of their lips extended to the back of their heads. This group of monsters-like creatures, the Sapphira Castle Keepers, ran past Klein and rushed behind him. He immediately regained his lucidity. Fuck. He cursed himself, his eyes slightly red as he continued running with his vision blurred. He went from the 5th epoch to the 4th epoch, and from the 4th epoch to the 3rd epoch. The massive shadow that resembled the tidal wave behind him paused for a few seconds, then it continued surging towards him as if nothing had happened, drowning out the historical voids he passed through. Klein didn't hold back in expending his spirituality. He used all his might to run with the light spots that he had lit in the fog of history. He ran from the 3rd epoch to the 2nd epoch until he arrived at a lonely fragment of light. Around him was a withered forest and a normal tomb. This was the period of history where giant King Ormur buried his parents. As for the tidal wave that was formed by Zeradol, it didn't seem to understand this history well enough. It stopped at some unknown era and didn't manage to catch up. At that moment, Klein's spirituality was almost exhausted. And in the fog of history, he could only borrow power from the current void. But clearly, there was no past projection of himself here. And when his spirituality was exhausted, he would have no choice but to leave the fog of history and return to the real world. When that time came, he would be facing Zeradol again. Phew. Klein exhaled and pulled out another paper crane. He snapped his fingers and lit it. However, after waiting for a few seconds, he failed to see the snake of fate, Wuxia, appear. In the historical void, there's no way to use ordinary paper cranes to contact Will. Why hasn't Amon appeared yet? As his thoughts flashed, he could only repeat in Jotun, the Evernight goddess who stands higher than the cosmos and more eternal than eternity. You are also the Lady of Crimson, the Mother of Concealment, the Empress of Misfortune and Horror, Mistress of Repose and Silence. After holding on for a few seconds, he suddenly had an idea. Hence, he didn't hesitate to leave the fog of history and return to the real world. Just as his figure appeared, his spirit-body threads floated into the air and was grabbed by a slippery, transparent tentacle. And opposite him, another figure appeared at the same time. It was the barefoot, linen-robed ascetic leader, Ariana. Based on Klein's abilities, the angel-level historical projection he had summoned must have disappeared. Therefore, the person who came was undoubtedly the actual body. The Evernight Cloister's matron glanced at Klein, and instantly, he vanished under Zeradol's tentacle. Klein entered a concealed world belonging to Ariana. It was night time, and it was a monastery with many ancient buildings erected. There was a huge and holy crimson moon hanging high in the sky. Using the experience gained from their past cooperation, Klein immediately used traveling to appear in the crimson moon, leaving this concealed world in order to appear elsewhere. After returning to reality, Klein had already distanced himself from Zeradol. Hence, he didn't hesitate to use traveling to directly leave. And having held Zeradol back for a short period of time, Ariana entered a concealed state and left the battlefield. Boom! A terrifying thunderclap boomed as the transparent tentacle that attempted to reach out to where Klein had disappeared suddenly retreated, disappearing along with the actual body. Having teleported to the sea, Klein couldn't be bothered to borrow strength from his past self. He first summoned a paper figurine from the historical void and shook his wrist. Most of the items he had with him had been destroyed when he became a bookmark. It was unknown where he had lost his marionettes, Konas and Inuni. Of course, they might have evaporated under the illumination of the Angel of Light. Pa! The paper figurine burned with scarlet flames as it leaped up into the form of an illusory angel that had layered wings on its back. It embraced him and removed any traces. Then, he activated traveling once again and left the area. In the secret mausoleum in Eastchester County, William Augustus I and Queen Mystic Bernadette managed to sense the death of George III, either through the changes in order or via their clairvoyant abilities. The latter didn't stay any longer. Her body suddenly separated like a collection of soap bubbles that reflected light, scattering in all directions before bursting. William Augustus I wasn't in the mood to stop or chase after her, but he didn't feel much pain. After making a huge detour, Klein, who had used Angel's Embrace 3 times to remove his traces, finally returned to Backlund secretly. It was probably the safest place. He didn't return to the apartment he had previously rented. Instead, he found a hotel in the Backlund Bridge area and got a room. Of course, he didn't forget to change his appearance, height, and temperament. The more ordinary and common his appearance was, the less attention he would garner. After entering the room, Klein endured the mental fatigue and physical trauma he received, and he began to chant the honorific name of sea god Calvetua. He planned to take 4 steps counterclockwise and head above the gray fog. He wanted to use his true vision and the real Angel's Embrace to confirm his surroundings to eliminate any latent dangers. Fortunately, Zeradol should have signed a contract with George III, so he can't leave the mausoleum he was guarding as he pleases. Otherwise, I would most likely have become his marionette in that chaotic battle. The appearance of him and Abomination Sua exceeded my expectations. Klein heaved a sigh of relief and took 1 step in a counterclockwise manner. He opened his mouth and chanted in Mandarin, the exalted. Suddenly, Klein's body trembled. His voice came to a halt as he froze on the spot. In his line of sight, a figure had appeared on a chair beside the full-body mirror in the room. He was a young man of medium build, wearing a dark-colored jacket and trousers. He looked like a mixed-blood man with Lone and Balam roots. This was the marionette that Klein had lost, Winner Enuni. Enuni smiled as he faced Klein's pair of eyes that could no longer move. Don't randomly leave your marionettes around. They can be tracked. As he spoke, he slowly stood up. He casually took out a crystal monocle from his pocket and slowly wore it on his right eye. Chapter 1151 Desay in a hotel in the Backlund Bridge area. Apart from his thoughts that still belonged to him, Klein could no longer control anything else. Even his eyeballs couldn't move. He knew very well that this was likely a deeper level of parasitizing. In this state, he could only look ahead of him in fear and despair. He watched as Enuni, who was wearing a monocle with a smile on his face, changed into Amon's original form. He took a step forward counterclockwise and opened his mouth to speak in Mandarin in an articulate and mellow manner. The immortal Lord of heaven and earth for blessings, did he steal my thoughts just now, or my ability to speak Mandarin? It should be the former, otherwise, he wouldn't be able to grasp this ritual. Klein's pupils couldn't widen as he watched. He felt an unprecedented sense of anxiety. As though sensing his emotions, the monocled man turned to look at him and smiled. He then took another step counterclockwise and whispered in Mandarin, the Sky Lord of heaven and earth for blessings. Following that, this blasphemer carried on the ritual with great familiarity. With every step he took, and every chant of the incantation, Klein's heart sank even deeper into a dark swamp, as though he could no longer see any light. The celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. When Amon took the final step and recited the final incantation, a boundless grayish-white fog suddenly appeared in front of Klein. He heard layers of pleas. There was no need to listen carefully, as he understood what it meant with his spiritual perception. After advancing to Scholar of Yore, he had obtained basic control over Sapphira Castle. No matter who it was, even if they had the correct ritual and corresponding incantation, they needed to obtain his permission to enter the world above the gray fog. Reject him. Klein was instantly delighted as this idea clearly surfaced within him. However, just as he had this thought, he had forgotten it. Standing there, he looked like a statue carved from stone. His intention of rejecting Amon had been stolen by him. Klein once again felt despair, but the grayish-white fog in front of him and the prayers in his ears didn't disappear. Klein was first taken aback before he understood what was going on. I understand. I have to head above the gray fog myself and control Sapphira Castle to give him permission to enter. There is no default option. This thought was like a straw which Klein grabbed at without any hesitation. It prevented himself from sinking into the water silently without anyone hear him cry. Although he still didn't know how to make use of this matter, his intuition told him that a slim possibility and his only hope could be hidden in this detail. At this moment, Amon stopped the attempt and cast his gaze at Klein. Clearly, he had failed to successfully enter Sapphira Castle. This angel of time adjusted the monocle on his right eye and smiled without any change in expression. Honorable Mr. Fool, your idea of saving yourself is very interesting. Amon had used the standard loan language, but every word seemed to be able to stir the powers of nature, creating one explosion after another in his mind. How is he so sure that I'm the fool and not the blessed of the fool? Klein felt his body turn cold as the hope that had just surfaced sank into the water once more. How am I certain? Amon sked and pulled the chair from before over and sat down. He pointed at the round stool opposite him and said, "Sit down, don't stand on ceremony." The moment he finished his sentence, Klein couldn't help but stride forward and sit on the round stool. Amon looked around the room and grabbed Klein's black silk top hat. He put it on his head and said with a smile, "Did you think that I wasn't aware that the ritual would be unsuccessful? It hasn't been long since Sapphira Castle produced an anomaly, so how could I forget? I just want to see your reaction." And you subconsciously felt despair and instinctively rejected me. That was very interesting. If you weren't the one who was called the fool, how could you have such thoughts? Dear Mr. Fool, am I right? As he repeated the 4 rhetorical questions, Amon looked rather pleased, as though he was an old hunter who had caught the fox's tail. I fell for his scam. Only then did Klein realize why Amon wasn't disappointed at all. He subconsciously wanted to deny it, but after some thought, he calmly said, "Kill me." I can speak now. Klein tried to control his body, but it was completely impossible. In the next second, he was prepared to recite the honorific name of the Evernight goddess, but this thought was immediately lost. The thin-faced blasphemer Amon pressed down on his right monocle and maintained his excited state from before. So that you can be reborn in Sapphira Castle, the more I talk to this fellow, the more mistakes I make. Klein shut his mouth tightly and didn't say another word. When Amon saw this, he shook his head with a smile. There's no need to be so afraid. Actually, there's no bad blood between us. Sitting on the round stool like a doll, Klein was stunned for a moment, but he didn't respond. Amon leaned forward slightly and looked into his eyes before continuing with a smile. The only conflict we have is regarding Sapphira Castle. But do you really wish to shoulder that fate? Aren't you worried that the original owner of Sapphira Castle will revive within you? This was something Klein was very concerned about, making him at a loss for words. Amon pinched the crystal monocle and didn't urge him to answer. He smiled and said, "If you give me Sapphira Castle, all the problems will be resolved. That way, whether the original owner of Sapphira Castle comes back to life, or if the corresponding fate can be shouldered, the person who needs to worry is me, not you. Also, I'll be the one to take over the subsequent arrangements of my zealous brother, Dor, and Lil, Zeradal's pursuits and the benediction of Evernight. And you will be freed from all this and just stay as a Sequence 3. Why would I want to kill you? What's the point of killing a Sequence 3? Even if I want to retrieve the characteristic, it's still expendable. My prey will only be Palez, Lil, Zeradal, and Dor. The rest will purely depend on my mood. As for the organization that you established, I can also help you maintain it. It's very fascinating and interesting. If you think this price isn't enough, then I can make you my blessed. Are you not pretending that the fool is the angel of time Amon in the City of Silver? This can turn into a reality in the future. I will lead them out of the forsaken land of the gods and see the light outside. When the time comes, you'll still have a chance to advance to Sequence 2 and become an angel. This is practically taking over all my worries and hardships. There are only benefits left. Klein, who didn't have a huge desire in becoming a true god and controlling Sapphira Castle, heard his heart palpitate with excitement. If he hadn't known that Amon was the #1 master in deceit, he would have agreed to it on the spot. But in the end, he still said without any expression, "Kill me." Is that the only thing you know how to say? Amon said without any signs of anger. He looked at Klein with piqued amusement. To him, this was a very interesting matter. It was completely understandable that he would encounter difficulties during the process. They only served to make success even more fulfilling and delightful. I'm just a heartless broken record. By lampooning, Klein eased his depression and despair. Instead of answering, he asked, "How do you know that the City of Silver thinks that you are the fool?" He didn't dare to say that the City of Silver still suspected that the fool was the god that Amon believed in, afraid that he would provoke him. Of course, if Amon was the type of person who would lose his intelligence after being provoked, he definitely would have tried doing so. This was because he now suspected that, after gaining initial control of Sapphira Castle, he would be reborn above the grey fog after his death. Unfortunately, Amon wasn't a king of angels from the storm pathway, but a god of trickery that gave even the true deities a headache in the 4th epoch. Amon laughed and said, "Do you think I only have 2 avatars in the City of Silver? Since you, the fool, and the hanged man have intervened, then I'm happy to quietly watch from the sidelines. The City of Silver is still accommodating Amon's avatar. Who's the fellow who was parasitized? Yes, previously, the members of the Giant King's Court's exploration team weren't parasitized. This is something that can be confirmed. As his mind tensed up, Klein felt that it was only natural. This was because Leonard had once told him that seeing one Amon meant that there were a bunch of Amons lurking around. It wouldn't just be a small handful. Without much thought, Klein tried hard to come up with an attempt to create an opportunity. You didn't rob me of my destiny directly because you can't handle it right now? Amon nodded frankly and said, yes, that's why I want to make a deal with you peacefully. But since you rejected my offer, I can only bring you to see my real body, to a sufficiently safe place. Then, your destiny will be taken away. When that happens, your ending will not be as good as I just said earlier. As he spoke, the black-haired, black-eyed man with a broad forehead and thin face slowly got up and walked towards the door. With that, Klein stood up and followed behind like a puppet. As he reached out to open the door, Amon seemed to recall a question. He pressed down on the crystal monocle and turned to look back at him. What's the fourth line of your scholar of your honorific name? In mysticism, every existence's corresponding honorific name wasn't that strict. As long as one used the correct format and certain descriptions to narrow the scope to prevent any ambiguity, they could point towards the corresponding hidden existence. This was also why quite a number of heretics who knew anything about mysticism could randomly make up honorific names while still receiving feedback. Of course, if it wasn't for the honorific name given by the hidden existence, there was no way to enjoy receiving feedback. Whether they established a connection or not depended on whether the existence was interested in the supplicant. Previously, Amon had used his understanding of the scholar of Yorin German Sparrow, and the powers of the Marauder Pathway Sequence 7 cryptologist, to restore the full honorific name that could point accurately to German Sparrow. However, he didn't attempt to pray and use the automatic response to establish a connection to lock onto Klein's location, because his godhood intuition told him that there was a problem with the fourth sentence, dooming him to fail. The fourth line of Klein's honorific name flashed across his mind, but he had no intention of telling Amon. At that moment, Amon opened his mouth and read out his thoughts. Protector of Backland magic and drama performers, this so-called angel of time and blasphemer fell silent for a few seconds after saying it out loud. Then, he smiled, very happily. After laughing, Amon adjusted his monocle on his right eye and said with a smile, to be honest, this is all very interesting. Are you really not considering becoming my blessed? Klein opened his mouth and gave a familiar answer, kill me. Chapter 1152 Error. Upon hearing Klein's reply, Amon smiled and shook his head. As he reached out to open the door, he casually asked, how did you think of such an honorific name? It needs to have a certain connection with myself, but also be able to avoid others from using the prayer's automatic response to lock onto me. There aren't many such honorific names. Seeing that his identity had been exposed, there was no need for Klein to hide it any further. Furthermore, he hoped to use such a conversation to grasp an opportunity. At the same time, his mind raced as he began thinking about how to save himself. I've been deeply parasitized. If I have any thoughts that aren't beneficial to Amon, it will be easily sensed and detected by him. Today is Saturday, and it's almost Monday again. If the fool suddenly stops the tarot gathering without any warning, the other members will definitely be terrified, nervous, and confused. Here, those who have the means to contact the world will definitely attempt to summon the messenger to ask for the reason. And once Miss Messenger approaches me, she will be able to discover the existence of Amon. Then, she can use the yesterday once again charm to recover to her peak condition. With the complete strength of an angel, she has a sizable chance of rescuing me from Amon's avatar. The most important thing for me now is to persist and live for 2 days. Yes, since Amon can't steal my fate right now, why did he try to trade peacefully? Even if I agreed to it, he wouldn't dare to let me go above the gray fog to grant him permission. That would mean that I'm free from his control and able to Sapphira Castle to effectively purify and make a counterattack against the parasite. Is the agreement itself a switch, and there's no need to follow up on it? Amon deliberately didn't mention this. As expected, it was a scam. Having grasped a sliver of hope, Klein decided to stall for time as long as possible for the next 2 days. The focus of Amon was still on the honorific name that no human and angel could think of. As he walked out of the room, he scratched his chin and said, "Have you provided any protection to Baklund's magic and drama performers?" "I've protected a trick master before." Having made plans, Klein was much more cooperative than before. He answered simply, "I'm a magician myself. I've performed many times in Baklund." The monocled Amon nodded. "Barely counts." He then walked out of the hotel room and went down the stairs to the street. Like a servant, he followed behind without any abnormalities. Looking to his left and right, Amon pinched his monocle and sighed with a smile. "How regretful." "What's there to regret?" Klein asked in puzzlement. "I've already been caught by you. What else do you have to regret?" Amon pressed down on his silk top hat and maintained his smile. "You can make a guess. If you can guess correctly, I can give you a better ending." Klein didn't believe in his promise at all. In order to not be tricked into revealing more secrets, he shook his head and said, "I can't guess it." "How boring," Amon said simply. He clenched his right hand into a fist and lightly tapped on his monocle. From the pedestrians, the trees by the side of the street, the sparrows on the rooftops, the rats in the muddy corners, and all kinds of living creatures in the air, illusory worm-like figures flew out, returning to Amon like stars. This son of a god status instantly rose to the level of an angel. As for Klein, he raised his left hand, and the human-skinned glove suddenly turned transparent. This was the activation process of traveling. At that moment, the only thing on him which was real was creeping hunger. The rest were made by using the powers of a faceless, as well as the glove using flesh and blood as the material. Seeing that traveling was about to begin, Klein was taken aback as he blurted out, "Why didn't you teleport in the room?" He had expected Amon to leave Baklund with him. After all, this was a place where even a king of angels had to be wary of. However, he couldn't understand why he would open the door, go down the stairs, and leave the hotel in such ordinary fashion. The eye behind the monocle swept across Klein as the corner of Amon's mouth slowly curled up. "I've already answered you. What a pity that you didn't seek help from Palez." This angel of time had an obvious smile on his face, but there was no emotion in his black eyes. It made Klein shudder. He's certain that I have some connection with Palez Zorost. Is it because of what happened the last time? No, stop it. Klein attempted to cogitate, trying his best to control himself from thinking too much, so as to prevent his thoughts from being stolen by Amon. Amon glanced at the panicking passers-by on the street in an impassive manner before looking up at the gray sky and saying, "I can only wait for the next opportunity. The most important thing now is to bring you to that place." As they spoke, both of them turned transparent at the same time and vanished from the hotel's entrance. None of the people who came over felt anything amiss. After passing through countless indescribable spirit world creatures and overlapping layers of different saturated colors, Klein and Amon appeared above the sea. Beneath their feet was a huge fissure. The blue seawater had been cut off as they plummeted deep into the bottomless darkness, like a waterfall without ever filling it. This was the entrance to the ruins of the Battle of Gods. With a thought, Klein asked, "You're taking me to the forsaken land of the gods?" The magnificent waterfall was reflected in Amon's monocle. He nodded slightly and casually replied, "That's right. When we get there, even your messenger won't be able to sense you through the contract." The forsaken land of the gods was clearly separated from the spirit world. Only by relying on Sapphira Castle could a connection be made. Amon knows what I'm planning to do. The flame of hope that was ignited in him was extinguished by the cold reality. He couldn't find another way to save himself for the time being. At this moment, the levitating Amon muttered to himself, "If my mausoleum in Backlund hadn't been destroyed by the Church of Steam, we could have used the abyss as a springboard to head there directly. We wouldn't have to go through all this trouble." Klein guiltily changed the topic. "The abyss is connected to the forsaken land of the gods?" "No." Amon shook his head and said with a relaxed expression, "But I can use some of its characteristics to go anywhere. I heard that there were some nasty changes in the abyss." With a thought, Klein probed. Amon turned his head and glanced at him without concealing his curiosity. "You're actually aware?" "Yes, I once thought of exploring the abyss." Klein didn't speak further, afraid that the King of Angels of the Marauder Pathway would discover that he could read Roselle's diary. At this moment, Amon suddenly laughed. "You want to explore the abyss? What's so funny about that?" Klein was very interested in what had happened to the abyss to begin with, thus, he took the opportunity to cooperate with Amon in an attempt to know more. Just as he finished speaking, he suddenly had a new idea. Using the conversation he had with Amon, he could grasp more historical secrets to speed up his digestion of the Scholar of Your potion. That way, he could try using it to deepen his control of Sapphira Castle and escape from his current predicament. This thought flashed through his mind as he quickly restrained himself and stopped thinking about such matters. In regards to his question, Amon chuckled and said, "Your visiting of the abyss is like offering yourself as a beautifully packaged gift to someone who wants it." Dark side of the universe? Klein was first alarmed before he made a guess. Amon nodded. He was originally the only surviving ancient god, the devil monarch, Farbaughty. Now, Without finishing his sentence, Amon leaped and jumped into the huge, illusory rift with the strong winds. With that, Klein lost the support of the wind and fell straight down. After an unknown period of time, the water that resembled a fountain surged upwards rapidly, throwing him and Amon to the other side of the severed face. Just as he entered the ruins of the Battle of Gods, Klein was hit by bright sunlight. He suddenly heard a series of intense and crazy ravings. It was like a thin needle that pierced through his eardrums and stabbed into his brain, filling every thought with immense pain. As for the worms of spirit that formed his mythical creature form, they gradually changed, as though they were about to give birth to a degenerate consciousness that didn't belong to him. The true creator's ravings. With regards to this, Klein could barely withstand it, but it was difficult for him to hold on for too long. There was no way for him to go too far in the ruins of the Battle of Gods. At this moment, he saw that the monocle on Amon's right eye absorbed all the light around them. It became unusually bright and white. Then, a thick darkness ruled the sky. Amon directly stole the day of the ruins of the Battle of Gods. In the darkness, this Angel of Time's avatar brought Klein to an island and made him sleep against a stone pillar. Soon, Klein arrived in the hazy dream world. He saw the projection of the giant king's court, which was filled with an epic feeling, opposite the black cloister and the cliff. Amon, wearing the black silk top hat and crystal monocle, appeared beside him. With a relaxed smile, he pointed at the projection of the giant king's court that was frozen in the sunset. "That's the entrance to the forsaken land of the gods." After some thought, Klein raised his doubts. "Don't you need to enter a dream at a specific location to open the entrance?" He couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope again. He thought that it would be great if Amon wasted a week or two of his time in the ruins of the Battle of Gods. That's right. Amon didn't deny what Klein had said. He casually said, "If you wish to open the entrance, you have to travel on a ship to the core of this ruin's waters. This might take more than a month, and you will experience many dangers that you're currently unable to withstand. As for me, I don't have to. Is it because you're the son of the Creator? Klein guessed in deliberation. No. Amon had one hand in his pocket as he turned to walk to the Black Cloister's entrance. In chaotic places like this, order is in shambles, and the laws governing them have mutated. There are too many things that can be exploited. As this angel of time walked, he turned to look at Klein. The Marauder Pathways Sequence 0 has a very abstract name, error. It was named by my father. He once used a strange word of unknown origins to represent it, bug. When translated, it's a Trojan horse of fate, the slug of time, the loopholes in rules, the manifestation of all errors. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.